Copyright the authors, under exclusive license to Springer Nature Switzerland AG 2023. B. Studebaker, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy https://doi.org/10.1007/978-3-031-28210-2_44. Dream Eating Democracy. Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Keywords: liberty, equality, representation, democracy, equity, legitimacy. There are people out there who think resentful voters are spoiled brats. Theorists like Steven Pinker and Brian Kaplan argue that modern life is, actually, pretty great. 1, 2. Some go so far as to say we are living in an age of entitlement. 3, 4. For these theorists, we think we deserve things we do not deserve. We want more than any political or economic system can or even should deliver. We need a reality check. We have to find a way to lower our expectations. If we could do that, if we could let go of our resentments and accept our version of democracy with all its warts, the chronic crisis would come to an end. Before the war on poverty, before the New Deal, our government made far fewer promises to protect people from the consequences of the economic system. When people expect little of government, they feel less resentment when they get less out of it. Whenever there's a chronic crisis, there is always a set of people who try to restore full legitimacy not by addressing the causes of resentment but by lowering expectations. In this chapter, I want to discuss 3 different ways this has been done and might be done, through the prisms of 3 different terms. 1. Liberty. 2. Equality. 3. Representation. I haven't defined them because the definitions are precisely what's at issue. Each of these terms can be defined in highly demanding ways. You can use them to raise expectations and demand more from government. But they can also be defined in less demanding ways, to manage expectations and make it easier to maintain legitimacy without solving problems. Over the past 70 years, there have been intense conflicts over the meaning of these 3 words. Slowly but surely, their definitions are being twisted to make it harder to use these words to make meaningful political demands. Much of this happens in college. Students in the arts and social sciences take classes that discuss liberty, equality, and representation. It is difficult to discuss political concepts in high school because of the culture war. Every time progressives and conservatives try to introduce more robust forms of civic education, they get in each other's way. The Progressive 1619 project faces stiff resistance from the conservative 1776 project and vice versa. 5, 6. To avoid that mess, most states adopt a lowest common denominator high school civics curriculum. They teach students how the American political system works, mechanically, while avoiding difficult questions about what the system is meant to do. High school students learn the functions of the 3 branches of government. They memorize how a bill becomes a law. It's all very boring, and students retain very little of what they learn. This means that you have to go to college to get into the classes where liberty, equality, and representation are discussed in any detail. Often students have to major in the arts or the humanities, or go out of their way to take relevant electives. These classes look like a rare opportunity to participate in sophisticated, elite political discussions. But in most cases, they cover the terms in a highly propagandistic way. Undergraduate students are encouraged to adopt strange definitions of liberty, equality, and representation. These definitions inhibit their ability to think critically about American politics. They lower students' expectations, and they make it harder for them to make political demands on our government. When they graduate from college and take prominent jobs in politics, the media, and the public sector, they continue to use the language they've learned at university. Many of these Americans think they understand the debates surrounding these terms when they have been systematically denied access to large parts of the intellectual tradition. They enter professional life determined to use the words they've learned to make the world a better place, but they lack the conceptual tools necessary to accomplish this. Over time, this miseducation waters down the quality of public debate and makes political discussions increasingly inaccessible to Americans who do not go to college or do not take the classes that discuss these terms. In the rest of this chapter, we'll discuss liberty, equality, and representation. For each of these terms, there is a rich tradition in the history of political thought. But each one is taught in a shoddy way too. American students in many run-of-the-mill undergraduate courses in the arts and social sciences. There's a big gap between what American college students learn and what the history of political thought has to teach them. Without a full political education, these students end up in critically adopting definitions of the terms that make it hard for them to meaningfully object to the political and economic system. Liberty. When undergraduate students study liberty, or freedom, the terms are often used interchangeably. They very nearly always read Isaiah Berlin. In 1958, Berlin gave a lecture where he divided concepts of liberty into 2 types. 1. Negative liberty. where you are free to the extent that no human beings or human organization stops you from doing what you would otherwise do. 2. Positive liberty, where you are free to the extent that you are able to realize your potential to be your own master. To have positive liberty, you need to be able to get access to things that are necessary for you to realize your potential. You have positive liberty when you have access to important things like education, healthcare, or housing. The state protects your positive liberty by keeping these things accessible to people. It might provide them as public services or subsidize them, or what have you. If the state is really convinced that these things are necessary for people to realize their potential, it might start mandating them. It might force you to go to church or school. Berlin was very concerned about that, because for him those mandates violated negative liberty. You have negative liberty as long as no one actively gets in the way of the things you want to do. If the state forces you to go to church or school against your will in the name of helping you realize your potential, it's stopping you from doing what you would otherwise do. It is therefore threatening negative liberty in the name of advancing positive liberty. Berlin's argument tends to push students toward negative liberty and away from positive liberty. The thing is, there are more than two ways to think about this. Quentin Skinner studies the history of political thought. He identifies three principal ways political theorists have understood freedom over the centuries. Skinner starts with freedom as no interference. This is the version that is most similar to negative liberty. People can interfere with us by preventing us from doing what we would otherwise do, or by using credible threats and intimidation to push us to do things we would not otherwise do. But Skinner also points out that some no-interference theorists also think people can get in their own way. For many ancient and medieval thinkers, our passions can interfere with our reasoning. We get carried away by vices like wrath, pride, lust, and gluttony. These vices cause us to do things we would not otherwise do if we were in our right mind, if we enjoyed divine grace. In this sense we can be enslaved by our own passions. For some modern existentialists, we act in bad faith when we allow social norms to stop us from doing what we authentically desire to do. For these theorists, we allow ourselves to be controlled by an internalized guilt, a sense of shame, or a fear of judgment. We act normal, not because it is what we freely choose but because these feelings have interfered with our ability to be ourselves. Some Marxists argue that we are false conscious. We are unable to face the reality that we spend much of our lives in jobs that force us to deny or ignore parts of the human experience. We identify with the work that we do and try to pride ourselves on it, pretending to be happy when deep down we're deeply dissatisfied with our lives. By hiding the truth from ourselves, we interfere with our ability to act to change this situation. If we can interfere with our own freedom, then protecting us from interference will often involve protecting us from ourselves. Berlin excludes self-interference from negative liberty to avoid this potential implication. He instead classifies views that emphasize self-interference as forms of positive liberty, arguing that they are really about self-realization. Skinner also considers freedom as self-realization. For Skinner, self-realization theorists think that human beings share a common human nature, or essence. For some theorists, this essence is political. They argue that we need to participate in the political system, to exercise the full set of political rights associated with citizenship. For others, this essence is spiritual. We are self-realized when we become virtuous people or people with the right kind of relationship with the divine. Like Berlin, Skinner recognizes that self-realization views can often empower the state to mandate controversial ways of living. The essence we are meant to realize can be defined in too many different ways. The authorities can decide to coerce us in the name of whatever essence they think we have. They can impose upon us a political or religious essence and force us to align our behavior with it in the name of freeing us. If you build your conception of freedom around the idea that everyone must spiritually realize themselves as a good Catholic or politically realize themselves as a good Marxist, it opens the door to a lot of state interference. But Skinner points out that there is another kind of freedom. He calls this the no dependence view. When we are dependent on someone or something, we rely on the arbitrary will or power that someone or something possesses. We have to worry that this someone or something might interfere with our decisions in ways that undermine our interests. If you are an editor working for the Washington Post, you are aware that Jeff Bezos owns the newspaper. If Jeff Bezos doesn't like what you publish, he could fire you. If Jeff Bezos doesn't like what you tweet, he could fire you. You depend on Jeff Bezos. Awareness of dependence causes us to self-censor. Even if Jeff Bezos never interferes in your editorial decisions, the fact that you know that you depend on Jeff Bezos to make a living alters your behavior. Even if Jeff Bezos personally reassures you and tells you that you have his full confidence, you will still be affected by the mere fact that he has the power to fire you at any time for any reason. If you are married to a person, the way your day goes often depends on how well you're getting along with your spouse. If you upset your spouse, the day often doesn't go very well. You might start self-censoring around your spouse to avoid conflict. Even if your spouse explicitly asks you to be honest and open, you might still be reluctant to say what's really on your mind, to express what you really want to do. You could live in a dictatorship where the dictator never interferes in your life. But even if the dictator never bothers you, you can never be sure that the dictator won't start bothering you. The dictator has the power to bother you, and the mere fact that the dictator has this power looms over you and everything you do. Where does the no-dependence view fit into Berlin's dichotomy? Berlin conflates no-dependence views with self-realization views. At the start of his discussion of positive liberty, he defines it as being one's own master. He writes, "I wish my life and decision to depend on myself, not on external forces of whatever kind. I wish to be the instrument of my own, not of other men's, acts of will. I wish to be a subject, not an object, to be moved by reasons, by conscious purposes, which are my own, not by causes which affect me, as it were, from outside. I wish to be somebody, not nobody, a doer, deciding, not being decided for, self-directed and not acted upon by external nature or by other men as if I were a thing, or an animal, or a slave incapable of playing a human role, that is, of conceiving goals and policies of my own and realizing them." This could be read as a no-dependence account. You cannot be moved by reasons, or conscious purposes, that are your own if you are constantly self-censoring for fear of what an employer, a spouse, or a dictator might do to you. But by the end, Berlin heavily identifies positive liberty with self-realization and criticizes it on that basis. I may declare that they are actually aiming at what in their benighted state they consciously resist, because there exists within them an occult entity, their latent rational will, or their true purpose, and that this entity, although it is belied by all that they overtly feel and do and say, is their real self, of which the poor empirical self in space and time may know nothing or little, and that this inner spirit is the only self that deserves to have its wishes taken into account. Once I take this view, I am in a position to ignore the actual wishes of men or societies, to bully, oppress, torture them in the name, and on behalf, of their real selves, in the secure knowledge that whatever is the true goal of man, happiness, performance of duty, wisdom, a just society, self-fulfillment, must be identical with his freedom, the free choice of his true, albeit often submerged and inarticulate, self. In this way, Berlin implicitly suggests that no-dependence views are a slippery slope that ends in self-realization views. But you don't have to subscribe to a self-realization view to be interested in being your own master, freed from dependence on the arbitrary will or power of other people or structures. The no-dependence view is a view in its own right, it does not depend on any self-realization view. Raymond Goose and Martin Hollis take this critique further. They suggest that Berlin uses the term, positive liberty, to run together at least 4 different understandings of freedom. The first is freedom as autonomy. This is the capacity to set your own goals. It is also the ability to exercise self-control in the service of those goals. A person's ability to set goals depends in part on their ability to refrain from acting on impulses that would be incompatible with their own goals. Say you want to pass a test tomorrow, but you get invited to a party. You have an impulse to go to the party, but if you go to the party, you won't have time to prepare properly for the test. If you have the ability to resist the impulse to go to the party, that serves your goal. Goose and Hollis are not suggesting that we must learn to control ourselves to realize some externally prescribed essence, but to achieve our own goals. They have found a way to integrate the ancient and medieval emphasis on freedom from domination by the passions without attaching it to a self-realization account. Goose and Hollis' second understanding of freedom is concerned with having the power to do things. To achieve the goals we autonomously choose for ourselves, we need the power to act in pursuit of our goals. This power is limited by all sorts of obstacles, not merely other people's interference. We may be limited by our own capabilities or by a lack of resources. If you want to visit the moon, you are limited by the fact that you biologically cannot fly there, you are limited by the fact that you don't have a spaceship, and you are limited by the fact that you don't have the resources to hire a small army of people to build you a spaceship. It does not need to be the case that anyone has interfered with your ability to go there. And again, this conception of freedom is about whether you can do what you want to do. There is no externally imposed essence at play here. Third, Goose and Hollis understand freedom as having the capacity to act in accordance with your authentic desires. For them, this means that not only do you have the desire to pursue your goal, but you also desire to have that desire. You don't just want to go to the moon, you want to go there. You are using your powers to pursue goals you have arrived at in an authentic way. Finally, Goose and Hollis offer an understanding of freedom as self-realization. But they understand self-realization very differently from the way Skinner and Berlin understand it. They suggest that we self-realize when we develop our capabilities as we understand them. Instead of realizing some essence prescribed by the state, we realize our potential in the areas that we consider meaningful and important. So, for Goose and Hollis, we are free when we authentically and autonomously choose goals, have the power to act on those goals, and further develop our abilities as we understand them through the pursuit of the goals we choose. None of these four kinds of liberty, alone or in combination, are forms of negative liberty. None of them focus on interference or the possibility thereof. But none of them justify the imposition of a way of life on other people in the service of realizing some grand human essence. It's almost as if Berlin were trying to hide these other ways of thinking from us. Goose and Hollis think they know what's driving Berlin. Berlin obviously thinks that the concept of freedom has suffered from a kind of inflation during the past several hundred years, in the sense that people have tried to build more and more of the components of a fully good and satisfactory human life into the concept of freedom itself. Berlin is not offering a neutral account of the possible ways a person might understand freedom. He is trying to stop people from using the idea of freedom to demand more and more of the parts of a good life. He is trying to stop people from using the idea of freedom to make ambitious political demands on the state. He does not want people arguing that the government should help them pursue their goals, or that it should help them develop their skills. Berlin himself was deeply worried about the spread of communism. He argued that the root of communism lay in the belief that there is one right way for human beings to live. If positive freedom is about self-realization, positive freedom is the road to communism. If negative freedom is the only alternative, readers have a stark choice. They can embrace negative freedom, or they can aid and abet the Reds. In framing the liberty debate this way, Berlin undermines every effort Americans make to get their government to help them achieve their goals. He also undermines no-dependence views. No-dependence views highlight a lot of ordinary, everyday ways we are limited by the power people and systems have over us. These views enable us to challenge the relationship we have with our employer, with members of our own family, and with the state itself. They also let us challenge the relationship between our country and the global economic system. As a country, we have become dependent on a set of oligarchs and corporations that greatly restrict American sovereignty. We are unable to make many decisions about tax rates, regulations, and trade rules for fear of being punished by an economic system that protects their interests. As our lives become more precarious, we also become more individually dependent on powerful economic actors. The weakening bargaining power of workers and professionals makes them more dependent on the oligarchs and corporations that employ them. The inability of small employers to easily relocate makes them dependent on market conditions in their local areas, and those conditions fluctuate too readily. In this sense, there has been a loss of freedom. Workers, professionals, and small employers have lost freedom individually, and the United States has lost freedom collectively. All of this is erased if you go along with Isaiah Berlin. For decades, theorists like Goose, Hollis, and Skinner have discussed a wide array of ways to understand freedom. But many undergraduate students get Berlin and little else. Berlin is given prominence not to expand minds, but to fence them in. Students who read nothing apart from Berlin think they know what the options are, and that makes it harder for them to see what has been excluded and blurred together. They come away with a less ambitious, less demanding understanding of freedom. When those students leave college, they become political professionals. They take their understanding of liberty with them. They tolerate and even embrace a system which, by many measures, is slowly making them less free. When ordinary Americans try to use the concept of freedom to ask for help, professionals use negative understandings of liberty to shut them down. Over the decades, a crop of right libertarian and anarcho-capitalist political professionals have come on the scene. They venerate negative liberty, and use it as a justification for further intensifying the global economic system. For them, any attempt to govern the movement of capital is a form of interference. 14-18. Equality. Even Berlin recognized that his kind of liberty could not be the only value. As he himself put it, equality of liberty. Not to treat others as I should not wish them to treat me. Repayment of my debt to those who alone have made possible my liberty or prosperity or enlightenment. Justice, in its simplest and most universal sense. These are the foundations of liberal morality. Liberty is not the only goal of men. Berlin was largely successful in watering down the concept of liberty. Unable to win the fight over the definition of liberty, reform-minded political theorists turned to equality as an alternative. Liberty became the value associated with the right, and equality became the value associated with the left. Equality is every bit as vague as liberty, and there are an absolutely enormous number of ways to define it. But most of the time, when you encounter the concept of equality in the wild, you get presented with two choices, 20-22. 1. Equality of opportunity. 2. Equality of outcome. John Rawls defined equality of opportunity this way. Those who are at the same level of talent and ability, and have the same willingness to use them, should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. But you can ask further questions about what it is that we should have the opportunity to do. Are we simply talking about access to jobs, or to social roles and experiences more broadly? Which experiences matter? Should we have an equal opportunity to make new friends? Equality of outcome is even harder to nail down. We might try to ensure people end up with the same income, social status, resources, happiness, capabilities, or welfare. Each of these might conflict with the others. Then there are further questions. Are we trying to equalize things for individuals or for groups? If we're focusing on groups, we have to decide which groups matter. Are we trying to equalize classes, races, ethnicities, genders, regions, or some combination thereof? We might also ask what our purpose is in trying to achieve equality. Do we think equality is intrinsically valuable, or are we pursuing equality as a means to other goals? Often political theorists do not pursue equality for its own sake. Instead, they use equality to get at concepts of liberty that are usually boxed out of the discourse by the followers of Isaiah Berlin. Martin O'Neill associates non-intrinsic egalitarianism with a desire to end the domination of one part of society by the rest. This emphasis on non-domination overlaps with the no-dependence conception of liberty. O'Neill writes that inequality is a problem because it creates servility and deferential behavior. When you are walking on eggshells around someone because you depend on them, you're being servile and deferential. You do not behave like they're equal. In political theory, we call the theorists who focus on no dependence and non-domination small r, Republicans. We call them Republicans. Because they are interested in political concepts that originally developed in the ancient republics of Greece and Rome. These Republicans view equality as a way of expanding access to the liberties originally enjoyed by citizens of ancient states. Ancient republics often excluded women, slaves, and the poor from citizenship. But those who enjoyed citizenship in ancient republics were free in a very substantial sense. They were not dominated, insofar as they had no dominus, the Latin word for master. In many cases, they had enough property to be substantially protected from dependence on market forces. In a Republican context, the idea of equality is potentially very radical if it entails extending the benefits of citizenship to the whole population. Equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are generally much less ambitious. If everyone has the same opportunity to be employed by some oligarch or corporation, everyone has the same opportunity to enter into a relationship of dependence with some oligarch or corporation. If everyone gets the same outcome, everyone might end up equally subject to our competitive global economy. On these conceptions of equality, everyone can end up equally unfree in the Republican sense of that term. The move to reduce the equality debate to a contest between opportunity and outcome is even more effective than the effort to reduce liberty to positive and negative variance. Many students on the left resist Berlin's move, but get ensnared by these conceptions of equality. In recent years, the situation has deteriorated further. Equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are now increasingly replaced in American university curricula with a distinction between equality and equity. This distinction does not come out of political theory. It seems to have originated in education theory. It is often presented through variants of a particular image, 26 to 32. In Fig. 4.1, equality is associated with giving everyone the same resources, while equity is associated with ensuring everyone reaches the same level. In the language of political theory, these both depict types of equality of outcome. Equality gets associated with equality of resources, while equity gets associated with equality of welfare. Often, students are told to reject equality in favor of equity. By telling students that equality of welfare is equity instead of equality, we invite them to dismiss not just the equality of resources view, but every other view. Every other conception of equality goes by the name equality. If you've been told that equality is bad and equity is good, then all of those other views must be written off. You're left with no choice but to embrace equity, and therefore to embrace equality of welfare. Fig. 4.1 The infamous equality, equity illustration. This is a new variant of the same kind of propaganda we saw with liberty. It pretends to introduce students to a nuanced discussion so that it can impose a single view on them. There are, however, important differences. Equality of welfare is not exactly an undemanding view. It would be pretty hard to realize equality of welfare. For one, it's hard to measure welfare. In the drawing, welfare straightforwardly means being able to watch the game. But in real life, lots of different positive experiences might count as welfare, and it's pretty hard to weigh them against each other. Even if we can agree on a way to measure welfare, inequalities of welfare begin early in childhood. Parents raise children in dramatically different ways, with very different outcomes for welfare. 2. Prevent inequalities, the state would have to intervene heavily in the family. Many political theorists have ethical reservations about these interventions, 34 to 36. At the very least, they would be politically very difficult to implement. Berlin's dichotomy was used to lower expectations and shore up the legitimacy of the political system. The equality-equity distinction seems to make students demand more. That makes it harder to restore legitimacy. Some proponents of the equality-equity distinction don't mind this. If you have anarchist leanings and want to abolish both the state and the traditional family, the equality of welfare view is useful. Theorists like Wigger and Book Hansen consider equity to be central to anarchism. But there are others who want to take the radical edge off of equity. This can be done by framing equity around groups instead of individuals. Group equity. It's very difficult to get all individuals the same level of welfare. But it's much easier to achieve this for groups. Say we have two groups, Group A and Group B. Both of these groups contain three classes of individuals. There are the oligarchs, the middle class, including both rump professionals and small employers, and the working class, including both fallen professionals and workers. To keep things simple and maintain our focus on equality of welfare among individuals and groups, let's control for class-based inequalities of opportunity. We can do this by supposing, completely unrealistically, that these classes all contain the same number of people and that a person born into Group A has the same opportunity to end up in each class as a person born into Group B. On these premises, to achieve individual equity, all 6 classes would need to achieve the same level of welfare, so that every person achieves the same level of welfare regardless of the group or class they end up in. Table 4.1 illustrates individual equity. Table 4.1 Individual equity. Group A. Welfare. Group B. Welfare. Oligarchs 5. Oligarchs 5. Middle class 5. Middle class 5. Working class 5. Working class 5. But, if we are merely trying to create equity between the two groups, the classes within those groups might have wildly different levels of welfare. In Table 4.2, Group A and Group B have the same amount of welfare in total, even though Group A's welfare is more evenly distributed among its members while Group B's is distributed quite unevenly. Table 4.2 Group equity, obviously unfair. Group A. Welfare. Group B. Welfare. Oligarchs 5. Oligarchs 8. Middle class 5. Middle class 4. Working class 5. Working class 3. This is pretty unfair. Only a person in Group B has the opportunity to enjoy a level of welfare greater than 5, and only people in Group A are protected from levels of welfare below 5. Most proponents of group equity wouldn't be satisfied with this. But we can add a caveat. We can say that true group equity requires not merely that the two groups enjoy the same amount of welfare in total, but that a person born into each group has the same chances of achieving different levels of welfare. In Table 4.3, the group you are born into has no effect on your final position. A person in Group A has the same chance of achieving a welfare level of 10 as a person in Group B. If this is equity, it's compatible with having a strictly hierarchical class system. Table 4.3 Group equity, superficially fair. Group A. Welfare. Group B. Welfare. Oligarchs 10. Oligarchs 10. Middle class 2. Middle class 2. Working class 1. Working class 1. Let's replace the variables with categories that are more familiar. If Table 4.4 illustrates equity, it's relatively easy to achieve. Nothing has to be done to improve the situation of small business owners, professionals, and workers. It need merely be the case that a person's race has no effect on the class they end up in. Table 4.4 Group equity, superficially fair, racialized. White Americans. Welfare. Black Americans. Welfare. White oligarchs 10. Black oligarchs 10. White middle class 2. Black middle class 2. White working class 1. Black working class 1. When President Biden took office, he quickly issued an executive order. This order concerned racial equity. Biden's order defines equity this way. The term equity means the consistent and systematic fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, LGBTQ+, persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. The definition is totally unclear. The words fair, just, and impartial are all clearly important but left undefined. It's not obvious that Biden is even using the word equity to mean equality of welfare. The administration initially applies equity to individuals, potentially suggesting a demanding interpretation. But then, it pivots to focus on underserved communities. These underserved communities are initially defined through a big list of examples. At the end of that list, the administration throws in persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. This vaguely expands the category of underserved communities in a totally imprecise way. No definition of inequality has been offered, and it's hard to see how persons otherwise adversely affected by poverty or inequality constitute a community. Perhaps aware that this first definition is not very helpful, the administration then offers a definition for underserved communities. The term underserved communities refers to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life, as exemplified by the list in the preceding definition of equity. This is poorly written. Why would the administration give the list as part of the definition of equity if the list is meant to provide examples of another term, underserved communities, which has its own definition? Why not just include the list in the second definition? We also discover that an underserved community is just a population that shares a particular characteristic, which could be anything, and has been denied a full opportunity. The administration declines to define a full opportunity, instead pointing us back to that vague list. At another point in the order, a different list is given. The Office of Management and Budget, is instructed to study the best methods, consistent with applicable law, to assist agencies in assessing equity with respect to race, ethnicity, religion, income, geography, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability. Here the administration admits it doesn't really know how to assess equity, let alone achieve it through policy. The is meant to study how to assess it. The second list consists exclusively of groups, with no mention of individuals. Income is on the list, but that doesn't necessarily mean the administration is interested in ensuring everyone regardless of income achieves the same level of welfare. It may merely mean that one's parents' income doesn't affect one's life chances. They've used the words fair, just, impartial, and full opportunity to describe what they care about, without specifying what any of those words mean. The Biden administration is not trying to offer a clear definition. If it wanted a clear definition, there are plenty of unemployed political theorists available who could help in a pinch. The administration wants to be seen to care about equity without committing itself to any particular understanding of that term. It wants to retain the ability to redefine equity in whatever ways are politically convenient for it. Its definitions use vague language that suggests that nearly any conceivable group might plausibly be protected, but they also use vague ethical signifiers to avoid making concrete commitments to do anything in particular for any of those groups. This is ultimately the big problem with terms like equality, equity, fairness, justice, and impartiality. They can mean an enormous number of different things. If you like the Biden administration, you can read these words and convince yourself that Biden cares about the things you care about. But he hasn't made any real promises. If the administration understood equity the way many anarchists understand it, as a commitment to individual equality of welfare, it would put itself in an impossible situation politically. It is too difficult to achieve individual equality of welfare, and the administration would fail to come close to achieving it. It is much more likely that the Biden administration will understand equity as a group concept, and that the Democratic Party in general will tend to use the term this way. They will also likely pivot from welfare, a nebulous concept, to something more concrete and quantifiable, like wealth. Many organizations are already defining racial equity in a way that suggests something like what we see in Table 4.5. Race Forward defines racial equity merely as a process of eliminating racial disparities. The Center for American Progress uses it mainly to argue for closing the racial wealth gap. Racial Equity Tools straightforwardly defines it as the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, how one fares. The concept of equity is being partitioned into a series of types of group equity, none of which have much to do with achieving individual equality of welfare. Table 4.5 Racialized equity understood in terms of the racial wealth gap. White Americans, wealth. Black Americans, wealth. White oligarchs $50 billion, black oligarchs $50 billion. White middle class $500,000. Black middle class $500,000. White working class $50,000. Black working class $50,000. If this is what equity comes to mean, what can radicals do about it? There is not much they can do. Education theorists often define equity in opposition to equality. If students learn that equality is bad and equity is good, then whoever controls the definition of equity controls the whole debate. There is no possibility of appealing to alternative understandings of equality, because equality has been boxed out by the conceptual frame taught to undergraduate students. To get a hearing, the alternative views of equality would all have to be reframed as alternative understandings of equity. It would take a lot of time for these reformulations to be injected into the literature. It would take even more time for them to become dominant enough to be taught to undergraduate students. It would take even more time for those undergraduate students to build successful careers and populate institutions. In the meantime, the people who want an undemanding, politically convenient concept of equality will not stand idly by. If they're pushed, they will invent new loaded terms and new loaded conceptual binaries to impose their terms on unsuspecting students. Oligarchs and corporations have money. They'll use think tanks and grants to pay academics to disseminate their perspectives. They'll get away with it, because equality is, like liberty, a very vague term. It can mean almost anything. In a society where oligarchs and corporations are powerful, they will tend to succeed in defining vague terms. We cannot use words to overcome power when power is used to define words. Of course, that doesn't stop people from trying. But the project is doomed from the start. Radicals will never win the definitional war over equality or liberty. Their hopes sustain the system, and while they are bogged down in these terminological quagmires, the concept of representation shifts beneath their feet. Representation. People often hope to use liberty and equality as emancipatory concepts. But representation has often been a conservative term. To say that someone is represented is to say that they can somehow be present while they are absent. When we appeal to the concept of representation, we are already conceding that the people we're trying to represent cannot participate directly. If they could participate directly, they wouldn't need to be represented. Representation can help shore up procedural arrangements that pretend to include people without actually including them, by suggesting that they can be included while they are kept out. As with liberty and equality, representation is often presented in two ways, 43 to 45. 1. Delegate representation, where representatives honor the wishes of their constituents, even if their own views differ. 2. Trustee representation, where representatives use their own judgment, even if it conflicts with the wishes of their constituents. The delegate-trustee binary is often used by political scientists. When they use it, they often claim to be drawing on the work of Hannah Pitkin. But they often simplify what she has to say. She draws another important distinction. 1. Representation as acting for someone. 2. Representation as standing for someone or something. Both delegate and trustee representation are forms of acting for. They describe how a representative might behave when a representative acts on someone's behalf. But a representative can also stand for someone or something. When a representative stands for someone, they are similar to that someone in some relevant way. When a representative stands for something, they symbolize the thing for which they stand. While political scientists continue to talk about delegates and trustees and the delegate-trustee distinction continues to be taught to many undergraduates, the whole notion of representation as acting for is increasingly passé. Our gridlocked political procedures don't produce a lot of meaningful action anymore. They conform to incentives laid down by the competitive global economy. Those incentives don't care what individual politicians believe, and they don't care what the public wants. We don't have government by delegates or by trustees. We have government by impersonal incentive structures. Our legislators are not ruling, they are being ruled. As the government's capacity to act declines, the concept of representation has begun to subtly shift toward the idea of standing for. If our representatives cannot act for us, they can stand for us instead. But a question then arises, who do we want our representatives to stand for? Do we want our representatives to stand for the American people as a whole, or do we want our representatives to stand for a plurality of social groups? Pitkin further distinguishes between two types of standing for. 1. Descriptive representation, where the demographic composition of the representatives reflects the demographic composition of the citizenry. 2. Symbolic representation, where representatives stand for the idea of the country, the nation, or the people, considered as a unified whole. If we view the United States as a patchwork of social groups, we'll tend to prefer descriptive representation. If we view America as a unified nation, we'll tend to prefer symbolic representation. As we discussed in Chapter 2, there is an intense struggle between cultural progressives and cultural conservatives over precisely this question. Progressives tend to see a plurality of social groups. They want representatives who come from the groups they consider important. The diversity of the groups must be reflected in the body of representatives. If race is a relevant group signifier, it becomes important for progressives that our representatives be racially diverse, in a way that reflects the racial diversity of the country. The same goes for gender, sexuality, religion, and other potentially relevant group categories. Conservatives tend to think of America as a single entity. They think there is an American way of life that all Americans participate in regardless of which social groups they may identify with. They want representatives who embody American values and who will defend them when they are called into question. For progressives, America is too diverse to speak meaningfully of a single, shared, American way. In their view, conservatives can only think of America as a unified whole by ignoring or excluding the parts of the country that don't fit their vision. For conservatives, America loses meaning if it is reduced to a patchwork of identity groups. They object to forms of identity they view as divisive or factionalist, because these forms of identity erode national unity. But both cultural progressives and cultural conservatives are thinking of representation as a standing for concept. In this respect, they are more alike than they are different. They are focused on whether representatives mirror us culturally. But increasingly, they pay little attention to whether representatives are actually acting for us, in either the delegate or the trustee sense. When push comes to shove, our representatives comply with the incentives laid down by the competitive global economy, regardless of their cultural orientation. Unable to differentiate themselves economically, politicians lean heavily on cultural signifiers to maintain voter interest. The more they do this, the more representation becomes about who the representatives stand for, instead of who they act for. The reality is that as structural incentives become more powerful, elected representatives increasingly behave the same way, regardless of the cultural groups they come from or their attitude to America as an ideal. They act for the oligarchs and corporations who dominate the system. Oligarchs and corporations aren't loyal to America, and they aren't loyal to social groups. The whole cultural discussion is an elaborate distraction from the reality that our representatives cannot and do not act for small employers, fallen professionals, or traditional workers. These classes are represented only culturally. Politicians stand for them, but they do not act for them in any economic sense. There are black politicians, female politicians, gay politicians, and politicians who espouse traditional conservative values, but there are no politicians who can protect ordinary Americans from the oligarchs and corporations that dominate American life. Even just by reading Pitkin thoroughly, we can get a more complex understanding of representation than we get from the delegate-trustee binary that is so often put in front of undergraduates. But there are many other ways of framing representation. For Quentin Skinner, there are three principal ways of understanding the concept. 1. Pictorial representation, where the representative is like a painting or a sculpture. The representative creates the illusion that those who are absent are present, by resembling them to the point at which the difference between the two is easily forgotten. 2. Theatrical representation, where the representative is like an actor in a play. The representative brings something fictitious to life by interpreting it, and then speaking and acting for it. 3. Juridical representation, where the representative is obligated to act for the represented. This could mean they require the consent of the represented, or it can more loosely mean that they are obliged to act in the interests of the represented. The delegate and trustee views fit largely within the juridical box. In juridical representation, it's straightforwardly the case that the represented exist and are part of the process. They can consent, and they have a set of defined interests. In practice, representation is rarely this simple. Pictorial and theatrical representation are more complicated. In the pictorial case, the politician imitates the represented well enough that it appears as if the represented are present, but this is never really true. When we have representatives who look and sound culturally similar to the people they represent, it seems as if these people are represented, even though they might not be. The politician imitates the people they hope to be credited with representing by giving the appearance of being one of them. Joe Biden often emphasizes his Irish Catholic roots. But that is no guarantee that Biden will govern in the interest of Catholic Americans or the Catholic Church. Donald Trump picked Ben Carson, an African American, as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. But that was no guarantee that federal housing policy would benefit most African Americans. Pictorial representation does not guarantee juridical representation. In the theatrical case, the politician is representing an abstraction. The abstraction doesn't exist in the physical world, but the politician makes it seem as if the abstraction exists by playing it, in the same way an actor plays a role. By playing the abstraction and acting in its name, the politician makes the abstraction feel like a person. In this way, the politician makes the abstraction seem real. Politicians can do this with abstract concepts like nations and groups. In the physical world, there are many different Americans who may or may not fancy themselves to be part of these abstractions. But by taking on the persona of the nation or the group, the politician makes these abstractions feel real and invites individuals to identify with them, tightening the bond between these individuals and these abstractions. The more difficult it is to achieve a sense of juridical representation, the more important pictorial and theatrical representation become. If politicians cannot really act in our economic interest, they must endeavor to look and sound like us, pictorially. They must try to embody abstract categories. If we can be made to identify with abstractions, we can get a sense of cathartic satisfaction from the success of our abstractions. When Donald Trump became president, many conservative Americans viewed him as an avatar of the American nation. If you feel Trump is the avatar of the nation, his successes become America's successes, regardless of whether his policies meaningfully help particular Americans. When representation is framed as juridical, as acting for, or as a delegate or trustee relationship, these other forms of representation are left unacknowledged. But they are quietly becoming the dominant forms of representation in contemporary American life. Increasingly, all we can expect from our representatives is a kind of cultural catharsis, and that catharsis is contingent on our willingness to believe that politicians are like us, that the abstractions they claim to personify are the abstractions we ought to identify with. If we can be persuaded that this is all we are entitled to, the democratic system can secure its legitimacy without having to do much for us. Democratic theorist Jane Mansbridge argues for descriptive representation precisely because she thinks it can help shore up legitimacy. She argues that in contexts of low de facto legitimacy, descriptive representation increases the attachment to the polity of members of the group. She writes, "Seeing proportional numbers of members of their group exercising the responsibility of ruling with full status in the legislature can enhance de facto legitimacy by making citizens, and particularly members of historically underrepresented groups, feel as if they themselves were present in the deliberations." Descriptive and symbolic representation are increasingly combined with other concepts. The idea of group equity synergizes very effectively with forms of descriptive representation focused around standing for identity groups. In June 2021, the Biden administration released an executive order that expressly uses the terms together. The administration hopes to promote equity in part by measuring demographic representation in workforce composition. Equity is achieved through making the federal workforce representative of the social groups the administration considers underserved. The implication here is that if the federal workforce demographically looks like the people it serves, this will make the federal workforce equitable. Representation is reduced to a mere means of achieving equity, and equity is reduced to a condition in which a shallow form of representation obtains. No matter which way we come at the discussion, we end up committed to little more than ensuring that demography does not predict class position, that people from all the relevant social groups are represented in every economic class. On the other side of the cultural divide, negative liberty synergizes effectively with forms of symbolic representation focused around standing for American ideals. If liberty is a core American ideal, but it amounts to little more than non-interference, politicians can credibly claim to defend American ideals without having to commit themselves to more demanding understandings of freedom. For instance, the right libertarian Cato Institute now has a Center for Representative Government. The center explicitly links representation to freedom from state interference. Taking its inspiration from James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, the Cato Institute's Center for Representative Government is dedicated to promoting limited representative government. Today, government offers many new threats to individual freedom and the virtues needed for its preservation. Unfortunately, career politicians, an ever-expanding government and massive regulatory constraints dominate American political life. The center and its scholars are working through books, conferences, forums, op-eds, speeches, congressional testimony, and TV and radio appearances to bring the ideals of individual liberty, civil society, limited government and citizen legislators back to the forefront of American political life. The concept of representation is slowly being watered down and combined with lukewarm conceptions of equity and liberty. As the terms are eroded, it becomes harder for Americans to express feelings of resentment and frustration in politically effective ways. Radicals who hope to use these concepts to deliver change maintain the status quo by lending credence to the illusion that these words still make meaningful promises. The more we are told that representation, equity, and liberty are radical or subversive ideas, the easier it is to politically instantiate toothless versions of the terms. If we can all be made to lower our expectations for democracy, we could find a way to a new consensus on the meaning of democracy itself. If democracy requires little more than negative liberty, group equity, and a mix of descriptive and symbolic representation, we won't have any way of connecting our resentment to political failure. We will slowly learn to live with a political system that ignores our needs, because we won't have a language for connecting our needs to the political. The democratic system will renew itself by eating our dreams, by turning our highest ideals into the lowest standards it can persuade us to accept. Is this where we're headed? Will it work? Obstacles to restoring legitimacy by dream eating. I see two obstacles to this strategy. First, it's not clear that Mansbridge was right about descriptive representation. She argued that descriptive representation shores up legitimacy by increasing the attachment of group members to the polity. Descriptive representation relies on the recognition of a plurality of diverse groups. Conservatives worry about descriptive representation precisely because they think identity groups undermine national unity. They prefer symbolic representation focused around national unity because they think symbolic representation is better at ensuring citizens remain attached to the polity. The disagreement between progressives and conservatives about whether representation should be descriptive or symbolic ensures that they continue to disagree about the meaning of democracy. Even if the conservatives are wrong to find descriptive representation threatening, the fact that the conservatives prefer symbolic representation makes it impossible for descriptive representation to effectively shore up legitimacy. When progressives try to use descriptive representation, conservatives respond by attacking group identity. By excluding progressive forms of identification from their understanding of the American idea, the conservatives push progressives away from the idea of the nation. Progressives don't feel they can identify with a nation that is fundamentally bound up with an exclusive conservative symbology. Consequently, the conservative critique of progressivism becomes self-fulfilling. Progressivism becomes anti-nationalist in part because the conservatives frame the idea of the nation in an antagonistic way. This tension between descriptive and symbolic representation is not unique to the United States. In the 90s, the United Kingdom attempted to improve Scottish attachment to the Union by devolving powers to a Scottish Parliament. The Scots would have more of their decisions made by Scots. They would be represented in a more descriptive sense. But many British Unionists think there is something inherently troubling about identifying exclusively as Scottish or English in the first instance. For them, Scottish and English identities are only appropriate if they come alongside British identity. Their concept of Britishness excludes a strong, exclusive identification with ethnic group identities like Scottishness or Englishness. Devolution encourages the Scots to identify as Scots, but in doing so it makes it harder for Scots to share in an idea of unionism that is British rather than merely Scottish and English. As the Scots become more estranged from unionism, the Unionists become more hostile to Scottish identity. They view strong Scottish identity as a threat to the Union and to Britishness. The two sides repel each other. In the long run, this makes it harder for the Scots to remain attached to the idea of the British Union, and Scottish independence referenda remain an ongoing threat to the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. Descriptive representation only succeeds in improving the attachment of groups to the polity if most people buy into descriptive representation. Because some people are conservative, in the sense that they prefer forms of symbolic representation that collapse identity group distinctions. Descriptive representation is unlikely to produce a new consensus on the meaning of democracy. By the same token, symbolic representation can only succeed if nearly everyone buys into it, and because some people are progressive and prefer descriptive representation, it is also unlikely to produce a new consensus. As we discussed in Chapter 2, strong progressive and conservative sentiments continue to be cultivated because large parts of the rump professional class have careers that depend on cultivating these sentiments. Political professionals appeal to the resentments of ordinary Americans. The global economic system creates resentment. Resentment fuels the professionals' culture war industry, and that industry perpetuates antagonism between advocates of descriptive and symbolic representation. It is the global economic system itself which ultimately frustrates the dream-eating strategy by generating all of this antagonistic energy. This brings us to the second obstacle in the way of dream eating. As we discussed at the start of this chapter, it's very difficult to teach these concepts to a larger number of Americans. Cultural conflict makes it difficult to introduce more controversial forms of civic education in high school, and many college students simply don't take the arts and humanities courses oriented around these ideas. An effort could be made to more effectively use the university system to disseminate political concepts. Proposals to increase the accessibility of the universities by making them tuition-free have not gone anywhere politically, but mandatory civics classes for university students are sometimes discussed. In Indiana, Purdue University recently introduced a mandatory civics knowledge test. It deploys some contested concepts, including representation. It often draws on traditional terms associated with conservatism and classical liberalism, like natural rights, limited government, and the rule of law. But the test itself consists of a series of dull, poorly written multiple-choice questions. It looks very much like a high school civics test. Politically, it's hard to get away with more than that, even at the university level. Once political education becomes mandatory in the United States, it tends to lose its bite. Even if more universities implement something like the Purdue test, only a small minority of Americans will advance past the cringy multiple-choice phase of civics education. This small minority will have the joy of being introduced to the cringy superficial versions of the complex debates about liberty, equality, and representation. These people will then take the bulk of the available professional jobs in the media, the civil service, and electoral politics. They're a loud minority, and they tend to crowd out other voices. But they are having conversations that are quite distant from the day-to-day concerns of ordinary Americans. They speak a form of political language that is inaccessible to most people. This makes it hard for the political professionals to represent ordinary voters, even in the descriptive and symbolic senses of the term. When political professionals speak about politics using inaccessible terminology, they do not sound like the voters. They do not seem pictorially similar to the people they claim to represent. Sometimes political professionals attempt to use abstract categories that are unfamiliar and alienating. As we discussed in Chapter 2, Hispanic voters don't vote in a racialized bloc. This suggests they do not think of themselves as an identity group with a concrete set of shared political interests. They certainly don't think of themselves as Latinx. When the professionals try to impose group identities on people who don't think in those terms, it can backfire. Political professionals can learn from their mistakes, but they struggle to avoid making new ones. They're playing a language game that is too far removed from those they claim to represent, and that makes even shallow forms of representation difficult to achieve. Try as they might, professionals who learn about political terms in university classrooms will struggle to represent people from different class backgrounds. No amount of gesturing at group and national signifiers can make up for the fact that political professionals increasingly sound just plain weird. Those who don't study the humanities in college and those who don't go to college at all won't go through this process of having their expectations lowered. They will continue to think that representatives should actually act for them. That is the one thing our representatives absolutely cannot do. And so, the dream-eating strategy will open up a gap between the political professionals, whose dreams have been eaten, and the ordinary people whose dreams continue to be disappointed. As we'll see in Chapter 5, if there is to be an end to the chronic crisis, it will come not by eliminating that gap, but by growing it. Copyright the authors, under exclusive license to Springer Nature Switzerland AG 2023. B. Studebaker, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy https://doi.org/10.1007/978-3-031-28210-2_55. No Escape. Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Benjamin Studebaker. Email. bmstudebaker@gmail.com. Keyword despair. Subaltern. Faith, family, fandoms, futurism. In Chapter 4, we discussed how political professionals and their followers become politically estranged from the rest of society. What, then, becomes of everyone else? In this chapter, I want to discuss the fate of those Americans who continue to feel resentment. Every political path these Americans might take is blocked. They cannot reform the global economic system, and they cannot overcome it by revolutionary means. The political professionals do not represent them. Their interests continue to be ignored, and politics continues to disappoint them. They have nowhere to turn, and there is nothing they can do. And yet, these Americans must go on living. They must continue to do the best they can to pay their bills, to pay down their debts, to keep their businesses open. What becomes of them? The path to despair. For the economist Albert Hirschman, people can respond to dysfunctional systems in two ways. They can exit the system, or they can use voice to try to change it. The more loyal to the system people are, the more they try to use voice before they resort to exit. It is very hard for the ordinary American to be heard. The political parties are dominated by the oligarchs and the political professionals who serve them. These classes organize protests. They decide what can be published, and they rarely publish people who don't speak their language or serve their interests. There is, however, one thing ordinary Americans can do: they can vote. As political scientist Peter Mayer describes it, voters increasingly feel they have been left with what is still called democracy, now redefined so as to downgrade or even exclude the popular component. Mayer suggests this produces more and more irregular voting behavior. Creeping fatalism makes voters feel their electoral choices do not matter much, so they start voting flippantly. As he puts it, there are more and more citizens who, when they think about politics at all, are likely to operate on the basis of short-term considerations and influences, a form of voting behavior that is increasingly contingent, and a type of voter whose choices appear increasingly accidental or even random. They may start by voting against incumbents. But as we've discussed, the left, the right, and the center cannot halt the creeping gains of oligarchs and corporations. The three factions all make a point to differentiate themselves culturally, but in economic matters they deliver strikingly similar results. Hirschman argues that the ability of voters to defect from parties that disappoint them in favor of seemingly different alternatives acts as a safety valve, diverting political energy into tame discontent. As it becomes evident that the throwing the bums out strategy doesn't work, the voters start voting for protest candidates. By voting for people who seem crazy, voters send a message to the political establishment that they want a more diverse set of options. American voters increasingly reward politicians for sounding and acting a little bit nutty. In the 2004 Democratic primaries, Howard Dean let loose his infamous Dean scream. Not only are we going to New Hampshire, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico, and we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah, In 2004, that, yeah, was enough to mark Dean out as an unreasonable person. But today, it's run-of-the-mill. Contemporary voters love emotional displays. They especially love it when those emotions look authentic. The more out of control the politician looks, the more authentic the emotion seems. They like it when politicians start crying, 4, 5. They like it when politicians shout in anger, 6, 7. Politicians have picked up on this. They have learned how to pretend to be out of control. The distinction between real authenticity and fake authenticity is slowly breaking down. We can no longer firmly distinguish between satirical candidates and the real thing. Celebrities, comedians, and media personalities can increasingly exploit the ridiculousness of their candidacies not just to promote their personal brands, but to actually win elections. While acting ridiculous can help these candidates win, it doesn't make them more effective at contending with the global economic system. Some Americans signal their frustration by voting for whoever produces the best memes. It doesn't deliver meaningful change, but there are so few other ways ordinary Americans can use voice. Even though it doesn't accomplish much, Americans are very loyal to democracy and to the Constitution. They will use voice for a long time before they consider exit. As their efforts go nowhere, voice becomes increasingly self-referential. When we start to feel that we're screaming into a void, eventually, we become frustrated even with the act of screaming. Increasingly, Americans are using voice to protest the fact that nobody listens to their voices. They demand procedural reforms because they know on some level that our extant procedures won't respond to them. But, as we've discussed, many of those reforms are never enacted, and those that are enacted prove toothless. They don't unlock many new policy possibilities, and sometimes they even increase gridlock. When, finally, Americans become exasperated with using the vote to express frustration with the procedures they use to express themselves, they'll resort to exit. Exit could in theory mean rejecting democracy, but without any credible alternatives to the democratic system, it probably won't take that form. Hirschman suggests exit might instead take the form of emigration. You've probably heard the expression, America, love it or leave it, but for most Americans, it's just not realistic. Emigrating is expensive. Many countries have restrictive visa rules. And besides, the global economic system is global. The other countries Americans could move to are part of it. Even if we can run, we can't hide. There is another form of exit open to frustrated Americans. They can stop participating in politics. They can stop following the news. They can stop voting. Political theorist Robert Goodin draws a distinction between striving and settling. In life, we only have so much time and energy available to spend striving after things. To free up time and energy to strive in any given area, we have to settle in other areas. When we settle for something, we make do with our current situation, accepting it, provisionally, as good enough. As Hirschman pointed out, there needs to be a reserve of political influence to enable us to use our voices. To create this reserve, citizens have to keep some time and energy available for politics. That time and energy cannot be spent on other things. If we find we're not accomplishing much by using our political voices, we can redirect that energy toward non-political life projects. But we can only do this if we settle for a disappointing political system. In this situation, Americans give up the hope that the political system will one day deal with the sources of resentment. They stop libidinally investing in the political system. The chronic legitimacy crisis is not solved because the sources of resentment are never dealt with. But Americans give up on trying to solve it. They settle for a system they still feel doesn't work. They politically despair so that they can find hope again in other areas of life. They accept and tolerate the resentment they feel toward politics instead of trying to expel that resentment through political action. Striving, settling, and sinking. This doesn't happen all at once. Americans who are politically deactivated can be reactivated. When voter turnout starts to sag, politics increasingly focuses on reactivating fringe voters. The larger the pool of deactivated voters, the more there is to gain electorally by finding ways to reactivate them. Politicians cultivate false hope that the unsolvable problem might yet be solved in a bid to reactivate voters. It is hard for voters to resist false hope, because it is hard for voters to be absolutely certain that they should settle. When Goodin considers when we should decide to settle, he writes, some easy answers come readily to mind. When it has become perfectly clear that you are not going to get what you were originally striving for, although quixotic quests have their charm too. When you discover some new facts about the project you were originally striving for that make it less appealing than it originally seemed. When something else more important comes up, and for some reason or another you cannot strive for both at once. When time has simply run out, either on the project you were striving to accomplish or on your own days on Earth. The thing is, it is unclear that Americans are not going to get what they're striving for. During chronic legitimacy crises, lots of competing explanations and solutions are thrown up. The center, the left, and the right all understand the crisis differently. They all propose different strategies for solving it. Even within these factions, there is disagreement about the right approach. Some believe in the possibility of reform, while others think change can only come through revolution. While it may be easy to say that any one of these strategies cannot be made to work, it's much harder to establish that none of them can. In this book, I've worked hard to show that all of these strategies are dead ends, but many people who read this book won't be convinced. Even insofar as this book does convince some people to abandon failing strategies, many of those people will talk themselves into pursuing other strategies that also won't work. New facts that cast doubt on one particular path out of the crisis do not necessarily lead to settling. They can just redirect that striving energy down a different path. Individual Americans politically deactivate from time to time because they become busy with other things. But this doesn't end the crisis, because individual Americans who politically deactivate are often replaced by new young voters and by reactivated voters. Some number of voters are in political despair at any given time, but democracy doesn't run on despair until it permeates politics, until voters are deactivating with such intensity and in such a widespread way that politicians cannot replace their energy. Widespread deactivation occurs when the political imperative to reactivate voters leads the factions into an arms race. They compete with each other to generate hope, and, where hope fails, fear. But when they fail to keep their promises, or when the other side fails to keep theirs, the basis for hope and fear collapses. This produces a reality check. When voters suffer a reality check, they tend to become more cynical and harder to reactivate. That forces the factions to make even more ridiculous promises to trigger reactivation. When they inevitably fail to keep those promises as well, the gap between expectations and reality grows, and the reality check hits even harder. After enough hard hits, people politically shut down. Consider how many reality checks voters have been made to endure since 2008. At the start, Barack Obama made vague pledges to solve the global economic crisis, promising to deliver hope and change. Obama's opponent, John McCain, downplayed the seriousness of the crisis, claiming that the fundamentals of the economy were sound. By framing himself as a striver, Obama elevated expectations for his administration and activated a large number of voters. But Obama could not establish a consensus on how to make sense of the crisis. As Andrew Gamble put it, a fundamental disagreement has emerged over what counts as legitimate policy. The fiscal stimulus of the Obama administration was regarded by some Keynesian economists as too small, but it was denounced by fiscal conservatives as having the wrong priorities, because not only did it fail to tackle the ever-rising national debt, but it also accepted that it was going to rise still further. When Obama lost control of the House in the 2010 midterms, his ability to pursue further striving strategies was thoroughly obstructed. From here, Obama's rhetoric shifts. He starts trying to downplay the crisis, to persuade his supporters that he met their expectations. In 2011, he signed the Budget Control Act, agreeing to reduce federal spending. During his 2012 campaign, he sought credit for the recovery, 13-14. The thing is, Obama oversaw a recovery in which 52% of inflation-adjusted income gains went to families in the top 1% of the income distribution. Between 2010 and 2016, many rural counties lost jobs, with half of the country's growth taking place in just 20 metropolitan areas. This meant that not only did Obama fail to alleviate resentment, he presided over a period in which for many people in many places it intensified. As Obama shifted toward McCain's position, the Republicans sought support from voters who still felt the country was in crisis. The GOP reframed itself to capture the support of those whose hopes Obama raised and then dashed. When Obama was the striver, they blocked his striving. But when Obama settled into a centrist posture, they moved into the political space he vacated. The Romney campaign, in 2012, said that Obama can't change Washington, but while some can't live up to their promises, others find a way. Before long, Donald Trump was very explicitly promising to look after the forgotten, claiming that he alone could solve the country's problems. At the Republican National Convention, he said, "Our convention occurs at a moment of crisis for our nation. The attacks on our police and the terrorism in our cities threaten our very way of life. Any politician who does not grasp this danger is not fit to lead our country. I have a message for all of you. The crime and violence that today afflicts our nation will soon come to an end. Beginning on January 20, 2017, safety will be restored. I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people that cannot defend themselves. Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it." Trump didn't attempt to counter the hope and change rhetoric by playing down the seriousness of the crisis. Instead, he countered it with an even more aggressive striving posture. Instead of winding down the expectations Obama raised, he raises expectations again. He calls the situation a crisis, and claims the American way of life is under threat. But he pledges that through him, all of these terrible things will soon come to an end. In this way, the opposition party not only declines to help wind down resentment, it increases it for electoral advantage. Of course, once in office, Trump swiftly began pretending he'd solved the crisis, bragging that the economy is stronger than ever before. He had to do this because, like Obama, he was thoroughly frustrated by his opponents and had little else to run on. In response, the Democrats returned to the striving rhetoric, with the left promising a future to believe in, and the center framing Trump as a terrifying would-be fascist autocrat only the Democrats can stop. American voters get whiplash from this. Wonderful things are promised and terrible warnings are issued, but very little comes to pass. Before voters know it, the same politicians who were sympathizing with them are telling them they ought to feel gratitude for a situation that hasn't changed. This produces a vicious cycle of striving and settling, of political deactivation and reactivation. When striving and settling become mutually reinforcing for an extended period of time, a third possibility beckons, the possibility of sinking into a deep despair. Politics without politics. When they are politically deactivated or in despair, Americans retreat from politics into four primary zones. I call these the 4 F's. They are 1. Faith, 2. Family, 3. Fandoms, 4. Futurism. I am not here to pronounce judgment on the intrinsic value of the 4 F's or to criticize the people who value these things or construct their lives around them. Nor am I suggesting that the 4 F's are valuable only insofar as they enable people to escape politics. There are plenty of reasons a person may value faith, family, fandoms, or futurism that stand apart from the political crisis we are discussing in this book. I myself sometimes think about basing more of my life around the 4 F's, in part because politics is depressing and in part because the 4 F's often seem to me to have a lot of value. I think about writing about Platonism, about having children, about writing about basketball, about speculating about the political economy of future societies. I may yet end up doing any or all of these things. The 4 F's are compelling and often pleasant, and I don't blame anybody for wanting life to be more compelling and more pleasant. That said, this is a book about contemporary American politics, and each of the 4 F's interacts with politics. Americans who are frustrated with politics look to other areas of life for meaning. Deactivated Americans try to hide from politics in the 4 F's, and political professionals looking to reactivate these people have to find them and drag them back into politics. This means political professionals must find ways to infiltrate the 4 F's, to politicize them, to make it impossible for them to function as enclaves. Because of infiltration, Americans who become interested in the 4 F's for reasons that have little or nothing to do with the chronic legitimacy crisis must deal with the fact that the 4 F's are constantly being politicized. Protecting the 4 F's from politicization itself often requires political action. The ability of Americans to avoid politics therefore depends, in part, on politics. To have a democracy that truly runs on despair, the American political system must find ways to politicize forms of non-politics and anti-politics. To better demonstrate what I mean, let's consider each of the 4 F's in turn. Faith. Faith often seems like an alternative to politics. In the United States, we ostensibly have freedom of religion and separation of church and state. In the past, historians have often viewed the spiritual and the temporal realms dualistically. British philosopher Bertrand Russell alleged that when politics becomes grim, both philosophy and faith become more escapist. He says this about Plotinus, a 3rd-century Neoplatonist philosopher. His life is almost coextensive with one of the most disastrous periods in Roman history. Of all this there is no mention in the works of Plotinus. He turned aside from the spectacle of ruin and misery in the actual world, to contemplate an eternal world of goodness and beauty. In this he was in harmony with all the most serious men of his age. To all of them, Christians and pagans alike, the world of practical affairs seemed to offer no hope, and only the other world seemed worthy of allegiance. But in more recent years, historians have increasingly realized that Russell's view badly misrepresents this period of Roman history. Historian Edward Watts observes that the apparent retreat into the spiritual realm was often appealing to Romans precisely because of the political power it could confer. For starters, a young Roman could choose to be a bishop, and bishops increasingly involved themselves in politics. But the life of a desert-dwelling hermit could look appealing for political reasons, too. A 4th-century bishop, Athanasius, argued that young men should abandon politics for the hermit's life precisely because of the political power and influence hermits might enjoy upon their return from the desert. Watts describes the hermit's political journey this way. These spiritual achievements ultimately led the hermit back to the world. When he returned, he managed an estate peopled by ascetic followers, corresponded with emperors, provided instruction to the entire city of Alexandria, and refuted the teaching of Greek philosophers. Ultimately, Athanasius returns, the hermit, to the world as a figure whose radical renunciation of conventional social and personal ties lent him a new, powerful type of authority whose value elites could immediately understand. Increasingly, even seemingly contemplative types like Plotinus are being revisited from a political perspective. Ordinary Americans do not embrace faith to try to have political influence. But spiritual audiences are an attractive power base for young professionals hoping to establish a following. In Chapter 1, we discussed how more professionals are competing for fewer high-quality professional jobs. As more professionals struggle to find meaningful roles in politics, the media, the arts, and the academy, they become embittered by these institutions and they start looking for alternatives. We are all familiar with the evangelical Christian televangelists, who use faith to have lucrative media careers many of them otherwise would not have enjoyed. These televangelists heavily mobilized Christians for conservative cultural causes. By doing this, they politicized Christian culture, encouraging churches and churchgoers to view their faith as inextricably linked to political action. This kept large numbers of rank-and-file Christians politically engaged for a while. But today, predominantly white evangelical Protestant churches are less politically engaged than congregations of other faiths. The National Congregations Survey reveals that 40% of predominantly white evangelical Protestant congregations report engaging in explicitly political activities. But 61% of Catholic congregations have done the same, along with 45% of mainline Protestant congregations, 81% of predominantly black evangelical Protestant congregations, and 59% of Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist congregations. The conservative movement does not have a monopoly on mixing faith with politics. In 2020, Marianne Williamson ran an openly faith-based presidential primary campaign as a Democrat. A substantial number of self-described American socialists report coming to socialism from a Christian perspective, 26 to 28. Beyond Christian socialism, there is also the emerging church movement, a pluralist attempt to inject continental European philosophy into the Anglophone spiritual marketplace, 29-30. The entry of the professionals into the faith space makes faith an unstable enclave for workers seeking to disengage from politics. As the standard professional career paths become less appealing, some professionals pursue faith-based careers. This politicizes forms of spirituality, and it spiritualizes politics. Those who truly wish to escape politics find that they must also escape organized religion, because under the guidance of professional preachers, faith so easily becomes politics by other means. It's possible that as Americans grow frustrated with the politics of conservative congregations, they get picked up by progressive alternatives and vice versa. But it's also possible that the despair that is creeping into American politics is also creeping into the spiritual realm. Across all Christian denominations, professionals are noticeably more likely than workers to attend church services regularly, while workers are more likely to say that faith is important to them. There are fewer professionals of faith, but among those who do believe, there is more commitment to institutionalized forms of religion. There are more workers of faith, but they are more alienated by professionalized religious institutions. The percentage of Americans who attend church has dropped more than 20 points since the 1980s. A full 34% of Gen Zers are religiously unaffiliated, compared to just 18% of baby boomers. Instead of exiting politics for faith, many American workers may exit both political and religious organizations, seeking meaning elsewhere. Family. The family is sometimes thought of as the conservative institution of last resort, the private space where traditional values can be preserved in defiance of the surrounding culture. But the family is not an exclusively conservative hideout. Plenty of people on the left and in the center have families. People who are unable to politically instantiate their values often try instead to instantiate them at home, and many liberal political theorists have considered the family an important tool for protecting liberty, 34-35. Those who reject the nuclear family model often embrace other kinds of household institutions that perform similar functions. When I use the term family, I am not excluding people who live with their parents, with members of their extended family, with roommates, or in communes. All of these social structures can potentially serve as enclaves from the political. It has become harder to make nuclear families work. As wage growth increasingly fails to keep up with the rising cost of living, it has become more difficult to build a household around a single earner. This makes it harder for families to achieve a division of labor that all family members will accept. In the 1970s, half of married couples were dual-income households, and half depended on a single earner. By 2010, two-thirds of married couples were dual-income, and just a third were single. In single-income families, real, inflation-adjusted household income has grown negligibly since 1980. Dual-income families continued to see income growth in the 80s and 90s, but growth plateaued for them after 2000. Almost two-thirds of American married couples now begin marriage in debt, with an average debt load of $30,000. Nearly half of Americans in serious relationships report fighting with their partner about money. To make things even more challenging, more middle-aged Americans are having to provide financial support to elderly parents and to adult children. More than 60% of parents with adult children continue to provide financial assistance to those children, and more than 30% of adults with elderly parents provide financial support to their own parents. Roughly 15% of Americans between the ages of 40 and 59 are supporting both a child and a parent at the same time. As economic change generates chronic stress, it's harder for Americans to get married and to sustain marriages. In 1970, 82% of 23 to 38-year-old adults were married and 70% were married with a child. In 2019, just 43% of adults in the same age range were married and only 30% were married with a child. This hits workers especially hard. 65% of college-educated Americans were married in 2015, compared to just 50% of Americans without degrees. Americans have increasingly adopted different household models. Today, 14% of millennials live with their parents, 14% live with other members of their extended family, 12% are raising children by themselves, 9% live completely alone, and 7% live with non-family members. For a significant number, this is not by choice. It's still the case that 58% of never-married adults want to get married someday, compared to 27% who are unsure and just 14% who say they never want to get married. A full 68% of never-married adults say that financial instability is one of the reasons they're still single. Why do so many people still want to get married? It must be acknowledged that romance has long been pitched to Americans as an escape route. Psychoanalytic theorist Todd McGowan argues that in the United States, genuine love has been replaced by an ideology of romance. Romance promises us a way out of the conditions that drive us to despair. Through an idealized romantic encounter, many of us imagine we will somehow be able to find the sense of meaning and purpose we struggle to find in politics or at work. In practice, real relationships with other people are difficult, and they are made more difficult by economic circumstances. Instead of helping us transcend our problems, the quest for romance becomes yet another expression of them. When partners inevitably fail to deliver them completely and permanently from darkness, Americans break up, cheat, or get divorced. They hop from relationship to relationship, the way committed political and spiritual idealists hop from party to party and movement to movement. We go through a cycle of hope and disappointment, of romantic deactivation and reactivation. In this way we forestall the arrival of despair. Regardless of whether we agree with critiques of the whole romantic enterprise, it remains the case that the economic space for families is contracting. Whether we like it or not, it will become increasingly difficult for nuclear families to persist, and other family models will be adopted. There will be more experiments in communal living arrangements, and more young adults will live with their parents or with their extended families. These arrangements may work well enough for some people, but there is evidence that they won't suffice for everyone. In Japan, real wage growth has been stagnant for the past 30 years. This has put enormous strain on Japanese families and Japanese youth, and more than 1 million Japanese now live as hikikomori. The hikikomori live alone or with relatives, but rarely venture out into society. They often do not go to school or work jobs. Many remain financially dependent on their parents into middle age, and there are now many hikikomori in their 50s living with parents in their 80s. When their parents die, their financial situations will deteriorate. There is evidence that this phenomenon is starting to take root in the United States, 47-48. Many of the mental health conditions associated with the hikikomori, like anxiety and depression, are increasingly prevalent among younger Americans, 49-50. Some young Americans are falling into a deep despair about their romantic futures. In recent years, communities of incels, of the involuntarily celibate, have sprouted up online. These despairing romantics offer each other emotional support, in part by viciously criticizing the women who turn them away. In rare cases, incels turn to violence. The incels have become fixated on the idea that their problems can only be solved by romance and by the family. They're looking for partners to save them. Unable to get the only thing they think will bring them peace, they travel a sad, dark path. As economic conditions make it harder to sustain any kind of family model, defenders of the family are increasingly forced to look to politics to shore up family structures. But the American political system is not capable of delivering the economic reforms that would be necessary to achieve this. President Biden's Build Back Better bill included funding for childcare. Rather than raise American wages to enable parents to spend more time at home, Biden sought to give Americans money to pay other people to raise their children while they're stuck at work. Even this proposal failed to pass. If the family ever offered a way out of politics, it is increasingly difficult to make use of it for that purpose. But there are other, less traditional ways of trying to escape. Fandoms. If Americans find themselves dissatisfied with the political, religious, and family structures available to them, they can instead attempt to construct a sense of meaning around the media products they enjoy. Many Americans try to build a sense of community around sports. For some, it's important to keep politics out of sports, to maintain sports as a non-political form of community, but that's never been simple. There are endemic debates about whether athletes and sports writers should get political precisely because so many of them inevitably do. The Trump presidency decisively shattered whatever remained of the cordon between sports and politics in America. Once some athletes began protesting against the administration, the rest had choices to make. If they participated in protests, they opposed Trump. If they refused to participate in protests, they were suspected of supporting Trump. Like many presidents, Trump invited athletes to the White House to celebrate their victories. But the president's critics expected athletes to boycott the Trump White House. There was no way out of this. Either you go to the White House or you don't. Athletes had to take sides. Sports writers understandably saw an opportunity to drive up clicks and revenue by encouraging athletes to make political remarks. Many made both solicited and unsolicited public political statements, 53 to 56. Regardless of whether we like these political interventions, they've made one thing clear: it's not possible for ordinary Americans to avoid politics by throwing themselves into sports fandoms. Just as many professionals enter the spiritual space in part because politics, art, the media, and the civil service have become too crowded, many professionals become sports journalists in part because political journalism is too competitive. They are excited to have the opportunity to inject politics into their sports coverage. They will work very hard to defend their newfound right to do this. In the age of the internet, the crusty editors who used to stop sports writers from getting political are no longer capable of performing that gatekeeping role. Increasingly, both athletes and sports writers will use sports to do politics and wage culture war. In the name of defending democracy, they will force sports fans to engage with their political views. If the fans don't like it, they will be accused of giving aid and comfort to authoritarianism. There are, however, other fandoms out there. Increasingly, Americans are retreating into niche fandoms that are not large enough to attract substantial regular media coverage. The internet has allowed Americans with unorthodox interests to find each other. There are message boards, subreddits, and YouTube channels devoted to many different television shows, films, and artists. If these fandoms get too big, they start to attract media attention. Celebrity musicians and film franchises are covered heavily by entertainment media. Many celebrities wade into politics, just as professional athletes do, 57 to 59. Many franchises become embroiled in controversies over whether they are political enough, or political in the right way, 60 to 62. But what about the little fandoms? Even when fandoms remain small and stay out of the limelight, they find they can't avoid political dynamics. To give a proper example of this, it is necessary to wade into something genuinely obscure. There is a video game company called Creative Assembly, CA. They make the Total War games, a set of strategy games. There are some YouTubers who cover news about these games. They are the bridge between the fans and the game designers. Some of the fans prefer games set in historical periods, while others like games set in fantasy worlds. One YouTuber, called Melkor, branded himself as a spokesperson for fans of CA's historical games. He made videos arguing that historical games were a good investment and would please fans, 63 to 65. He accumulated more than 28,000 subscribers. Eventually, Creative Assembly released a new historical game. Melkor championed the game on his channel. He received early access to the game, and he promoted it heavily to the fans. When the game released, many fans considered it disappointing. Melkor was stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he defended the game, the fans would be unhappy with him, but if he criticized the game, CA would be unhappy with him. He ended up making videos both praising and criticizing the game, 67, 68. No one was happy with him, and he received a lot of criticism. He became increasingly unhappy, 69, 70. Eventually he quit making Total War videos. In his final video, he despaired. After 5 years of studying this community deeply and dearly, I 100% know that CA are to blame for all those major aspects of internal toxicity that exists within this space. There's more divides here than near enough anywhere else. And, despite my best efforts to break such divides down, to get the communities to unite, I have failed. The more energy fans put into fandoms, the more political fandoms become. Media professor Mark Duffett argues that fandoms are a way of engaging with the power relations that characterize mass media. It becomes important to the fans to ensure that the kind of media they enjoy continues to be produced. This forces fans to become interested in the way the culture industry works. They start building theories about how companies make creative decisions. They begin trying to use their voices to get the kind of content they want. Prominent figures in communities, like Melkor, become representatives of different currents in their fandoms. They take fans' grievances to companies, and they explain the company's decisions to the fans. But the fans operate at a distinct power disadvantage, and when they are disappointed, they turn on their representatives. Sometimes they threaten to stop consuming content, to exit the fandom. They go through all the forms of political expression Hirschman outlined, but they do it not to change public policy but to get companies to produce the forms of entertainment they prefer. Literary theorist Hannah Muller argues that fandoms have always been quasi-political. Even at smaller scales, fandoms become interested in creating and sustaining an ideal community. Often, divisions open up, and fandoms become an alternative public sphere, a place where fans discuss their shared interests and deliberate over the procedures they use to moderate their discussions. These discussions and meta-discussions feel more participatory than ordinary political discussions, especially in the early stages, when the fandom is small and individual participants can easily make themselves heard. But they swiftly replicate the cultural divisions that characterize ordinary politics. Muller argues that fandoms are characterized by a conflict between heterogeneous voices and a default, fanish identity that was for the most part considered English-speaking and predominantly white. This mirrors the conflict between descriptive and symbolic representation we discussed in Chapter 4. Progressive fans want their fandoms to reflect the heterogeneity of the fans who make them up, while conservative fans want their fandoms to generate a sense of unity by reflecting a set of shared values. Both progressives and conservatives participate in fandoms as an alternative to mainstream politics. But progressives flee politics in search of spaces they feel better acknowledge group diversity, while conservatives flee politics in search of spaces they feel enable them to enjoy a sense of unity. They therefore enter fandoms for conflicting reasons. The culture war is replicated within the alternative public sphere. These divisions are easily exploited by media companies and by political professionals. By playing into these antagonisms, they can get fans to buy things and they can even get fans to politically reactivate for a time. Muller puts it this way. Corporations and political actors have predictably reacted to these developments with efforts to regulate, commercialize, appropriate, and infiltrate fanish spaces, practices, and content for their own interests. The heavy use of participatory elements in transmedia marketing can support civic participatory engagement by boosting the fan's sense of agency. This already precarious and complex relationship between fan-organized activism and capitalism has become even more fraught with the efforts from political actors to infiltrate fanish platforms and exploit and steer politicized energies within fan communities. Ultimately, the same frustrations that mar politics reappear in fandoms. It is too easy for fans to become divided about the kind of content they want media companies to produce. Media companies are even less democratic than governments. Their executives answer to shareholders, not fans. The media companies don't have to respond to the fans' demands, and they can exploit divisions within fandoms to give the impression they're listening when they're not. When the conversation about the content gets too hot, the companies can distract from substantive controversies by kicking up meta-conversations about the quality of the discourse within their fandoms. The people who don't like the new products are framed as toxic. They're on the wrong side of the culture war. The same cultural disputes that divide and frustrate voters thus divide and frustrate fans. It should not surprise us that media corporations let us down. But in our frustration with democracy, Americans often seek solace from structures that are even less responsive to us than democracy is. Futurism. Futurists are not merely interested in the future, they are enthusiastic about what the future might bring. They are motivated, in the present, by what they think they, or their descendants, or even humanity or the universe writ large, might get out of the future. Futurists believe in science and technology, and they believe in the human systems they associate with scientific and technological development. While media companies promise an escape in the present, tech companies promise a destination that will make the journey worth it. Through fictional universes, the entertainment industry offers something pretend right now. By contrast, tech companies offer something that will ostensibly become real if you have the patience. Futurism is therefore more appealing to rump professionals who have the resources to be patient. It is particularly appealing for professionals in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math fields. If your work is contributing to the future and you really believe in what the future holds, your work will feel valuable in an obvious way. Tech companies have every incentive to encourage their workers to be futurists. If they're futurists, they will work longer hours for less money in service of the cause. Tech companies do this in part by presenting themselves not merely as corporations, but as the expressions of the will of particular oligarchs. They frame these oligarchs as uniquely gifted geniuses. A person who worked for Apple in the O was not just working for Apple, but for Steve Jobs. A person who works for SpaceX doesn't just work for SpaceX, but for Elon Musk. The genius is meant to be so brilliant as to transcend the political and economic obstacles that stand in the way of the future. The charismatic leader figure is a common trope in the history of political thought. Often, when political theorists can see no straightforward way out of predicaments, they posit, with varying levels of seriousness, that some tremendously capable person might come along and somehow, through sheer brilliance, set things right. We see this in Carl Schmitt, Max Weber, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Machiavelli, Thomas More, and even Plato, 74 to 79. This figure goes by many names. Sometimes theorists use examples, like Lycurgus, the semi-legendary Spartan lawgiver. Other times they make reference to an order of republics, or legislator, or sovereign dictator. Some frame this person as legally, philosophically, militarily, or spiritually gifted, while others, like Schmitt and Weber, frame this person as a specifically political figure. But in all these accounts the special one comes along, shatters all the barriers, and creates a new kind of political system. By contrast, the tech oligarchs have largely positioned themselves as non-political or even anti-political. When their new technologies get politicized, the oligarchs receive attention from political actors they do not necessarily welcome. When Facebook became a political football after the 2016 presidential election, Mark Zuckerberg was horrified to find himself at the center of controversy. Political theorist David Runciman describes Zuckerberg as having bumbled his way into politics. Facebook, starting with Zuckerberg, has expressed genuine surprise at discovering how its technology can be used to spread fake news. The architects of its system are stumbling across its pitfalls with the rest of us. There is every reason to believe Zuckerberg when he says he wants to make the manipulation stop. He didn't intend for it to happen. That's the problem. No one did. It is just a side effect of being in the advertising business. The more political the tech geniuses get, the more their genius credentials come under scrutiny. The charisma of the tech oligarchs depends on the widespread belief that they are geniuses, that they are, in fact, very smart. American politics is riven with division. Any attempt by the oligarchs to do politics generates attacks on their intelligence, along with attempts by regulators and trust busters to make a mess of their business empires. So, instead of pitching themselves as public revolutionaries, they frame themselves as leaders of a private revolution. This revolution changes society not by replacing or reinvigorating democracy, but by creating new choices, new things, and new experiences people can buy or invest in. When tech oligarchs try to do more than this, the cost to their personal brands is both enormous and difficult to recoup. The sinews of futurism are pitched as potentially life-changing. At the extreme, there's going to Mars with Elon Musk, but for those with less patience there are cryptocurrencies, non-fungible tokens, and an enormous array of new ways to gamble and speculate. An infamous ad for Crypto.com features the actor Matt Damon explicitly comparing buying cryptocurrencies to going to space. It is through these mechanisms that working people are brought into futurism. Incredibly famous celebrities now film ads promising ordinary people that if they buy the right new financial product, they can get rich quick, and their conundrums will be solved. If you're looking for one of the other F's, for faith, family, or fandoms, the futurists will promise to help you find it online, through dating apps, social networks, and even AI companions. While the political system may eternally disappoint, futurists bet on the ability of the economic system to overcome political problems. The oligarchs and celebrities are the people who have been financially successful in the existing system. As it becomes more difficult to be financially successful, the people who do manage to succeed develop a mystique. If they are successful because they are geniuses, then they have some special ineffable quality mere mortals cannot obtain. Like blue-blooded aristocrats, they appear to have been chosen, in some sense, by nature, to lead. If they are successful because of personal virtues, then they are examples to follow. Their lifestyles are to be imitated. Whatever they invest in or consume becomes desirable. This hagiography around virtuous genius oligarchs forms when large numbers of people take the economic system for granted. This tendency makes futurists stand out. Those who commit to faith, family, or fandoms often harbor implicit or explicit critiques of the economic system, even if they do not act upon those critiques politically. The retreat into faith, family, and fandoms is in part about finding a space free not just from politics, but from market forces. All three of these structures allow participants to build communities around alternative values, values that may not be otherwise economically or socially rewarded. But futurism is an investment in the economic system itself, and in the people who embody the values that the economic system rewards. So, while futurism is an escape from democratic politics, it is decidedly not an escape from capitalist economics. The penetration of politics into faith, families, and fandoms comes alongside marketization. Political professionals wage culture war because it's profitable. They stoke cultural conflict among the faithful and within fandoms to increase clicks, views, and donations. As economic conditions become more difficult for families, family structures are increasingly determined by the need to economically survive, rather than by the alternative value sets of those who enter into them. Politics and capitalism are introduced into these spaces together, and they work together to diminish the space for alternative value sets. But because futurism is a way of economically leaning in, it contains no alternative value set. The values of the futurists are the values associated with rich, successful oligarchs and celebrities. They are more explicit, more intense versions of the values the economic system already rewards. This is not to say that there are no forms of futurism associated with economic critique. Some left libertarians and some Marxists advocate forms of accelerationism. Accelerationists critique the economic system, but doubt the ability of the political system to meaningfully reform the economy on its own. Instead, they hope that further technological changes will eventually force the economic system to change. By increasing the intensity of economic development, they hope to accelerate these technological changes and hasten the arrival of a new era, 83 to 85. Much of this is based in some way on readings of Karl Marx's theory of history, 86 to 90. On these readings, capitalism breaks down and dissolves traditional social structures, creating a sociological vacuum that must eventually be filled with something new. There are many different versions of what the something new is meant to be, and how the something new is meant to come about. Economic and technological determinists straightforwardly argue that as capitalism develops technology, automation will render the employer-employee relationship obsolete, forcing us to develop new economic and social structures. More dialectical accounts argue that as capitalism develops, it creates new modes of thinking and being, and these new forms of consciousness enable us to act in fundamentally new ways. Whether this happens through a kind of determinism, human agency, raw contingency, or some combination of these things, these accounts share a core feature. Problems with the economy are overcome not primarily through political means but by continuing with the process of economic development until it runs its course, in some sense. These types of Marxism are forms of futurism, insofar as futurism avoids contemporary electoral politics by leaning in economically, by committing to seeing capitalism through to its conclusion. Both the right libertarian and the left accelerationist hope that capitalism will eventually deliver a better life. The right libertarian might be excited to go to Mars with Elon Musk, while the left accelerationist might hope that the process of trying to go to Mars will end in the annihilation of Musk's empire. But both think that something of value will eventually be accomplished by continuing down this path, by sticking with this system and seeing where it leads. Futurism, then, is a kind of de facto endorsement of existing economic trends. Whether out of genuine commitment to the existing system or out of a belief that this system will open up new possibilities in the future, futurists are often interested in helping oligarchs and corporations achieve their near-term goals. While these goals are pitched as private and non-political, they have clear political consequences. They further enrich the oligarchs and further erode the positions of the workers, professionals, and small employers. Futurism is a hope narrative about the economy. If you believe in the future of the economy, you can be induced to participate in politics to defend the economic system if and when it comes under threat. If you believe in specific oligarchs, celebrities, or corporations, you can be induced to participate in politics when doing so removes obstacles to the economic schemes of the specific people or firms in which you placed your hope. You can do all this while cynically deriding the political system as hopelessly defective or behind the times. Indeed, the political cynicism of the futurist is the very thing that keeps the futurist's political engagement from threatening democracy. The futurist has no interest in overthrowing democracy, not because the futurist cares about democracy, but because futurists have come to view politics itself as little more than a peripheral, annoying interloper in economic affairs. The American subaltern. The Americans who retreat into the 4Fs are politically stuck. They are part of America, but they cannot get American political institutions to act for them. They can vote, and they might intermittently feel represented descriptively, symbolically, pictorially, and theatrically, but these forms of representation don't help them deal with the real problems they face in their day-to-day lives. I want to suggest that, increasingly, these Americans are a kind of subaltern. The idea of the subaltern originates in the prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci, an Italian politician who was imprisoned by the Mussolini regime in the 1920s and 30s. In the late 20th century, the idea of the subaltern became associated with total exclusion from representation. Theorists like Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak drew a sharp distinction between the subaltern and the citizen, suggesting that the subaltern lacks what the citizen possesses. On this kind of view, the citizen is represented, while the subaltern is not. If the subaltern is totally excluded from citizenship, it would seem ridiculous to describe the majority of Americans as subaltern. The term would seem to be more appropriate for colonized peoples or marginalized groups. But Gramsci himself applied the term in a Western European context, to the majority of the citizens living in countries like France and Italy. More recent interpretations of Gramsci break down the binary distinction between the subaltern and the citizenry. Political theorist Peter Thomas puts it this way: Citizenship is conceived not as a supplement or corrective to the subaltern's otherness, but as one of the forms of the political expression of subalternity. In other words, citizenship and subalternity in the prison notebooks are in a relationship of simultaneous co-constitution. The two concepts can be regarded as different vocabularies for describing, and in so doing validating or challenging, the same historical process. On the one hand, the narrative of political modernity is the consolidation of juridical forms guaranteeing individual rights and responsibilities within a homogeneous political community. On the other hand, the history of the constitution of hegemonic relations of subordination between classes and groups, with dominance by one group in political society depriving other groups of the capacity for self-direction and autonomous political initiative in civil society. Conceived as two sides of the same coin, the two vocabularies can thus be seen as developing in parallel, reinforcing or subverting each other. Thomas expressly links this account of the subaltern to political theorist Etienne Balibar's idea of the citizen subject. Ordinary citizens in modern Western democracies never fully actualize the capacities we ascribe to them. They are always subjects of a political system they do not and cannot control. Yet they are never fully recognized as subjects, precisely because the rights and capacities associated with citizenship are always ascribed to them. This allows the citizens to be blamed for everything that happens. As citizens, it is their civic duty, their responsibility, to politically engage. Yet when they do politically engage, they find that they are subjects, that their political efforts do not issue in anything real. When they don't do politics, they are blamed for failing to act, and when they do try to do politics, they find they cannot do it, except in the most superficial and meaningless senses. We can think of the subaltern as the part of society that has the formal rights of citizenship but cannot make full use of those rights. It is nominally and superficially represented and included in politics, but its interests are never politically realized. Often in the United States we think of minorities and marginalized groups as disenfranchised, but the subaltern is a pseudo-enfranchised majority. The majority of Americans are workers, fallen professionals, and small employers. Most American citizens cannot fully operationalize the rights of citizenship. Their experience of American citizenship is the dominant experience. In this way, what it means to be an American citizen in the 21st century is in large part to be alienated from the political capacities that have been formally ascribed to you. The political professionals and their followers constantly berate subaltern Americans for the degree to which they are politically deactivated. They scorn the subaltern tendency to prefer private life to public life, to seek solace in the 4 F's. By heaping blame and shame on the subaltern for failing to use political capacities that exist only on paper, the political professionals and their followers only further alienate the subaltern. If we listen to the sound of American culture, we hear an intense culture war waged by hyperpoliticized professionals in a language learned at university. But if we look closely, beneath all that noise, the subaltern quietly disdains what passes for 21st century American politics. This quiet disdain is difficult to access. The subaltern Americans are not oligarchs and cannot easily make themselves heard through the media platforms and institutions that oligarchs control. Because many in the subaltern understand that trying to do politics is pointless, they rarely express political views in public. When they do express political views, they often do not focus on making their views shareable or marketable or search engine optimized. On those rare occasions where members of the subaltern do make themselves heard, it is often when they have been reactivated. Political professionals and oligarchs infiltrate the 4 F's to sow conflict for the purposes of extracting political action from the subaltern. Subaltern political acts are therefore very often a response to perceived or real provocations or threats from the dominant classes. The subaltern therefore does not take the offensive and organize itself politically for reasons wholly its own. So, when it does appear to speak, it often speaks as a sock puppet for the classes that have stirred it up. The actions attributed to it are astroturfed, there's no real grass. Some political professionals make claims about what the subaltern thinks, as even I am doing here. Often, we mistranslate or misrepresent it, deliberately or by accident. When political professionals misrepresent the subaltern is rarely in position to effectively challenge the misrepresentation. So, when an interpretation of the subaltern is challenged, it is most often challenged by other professionals. These conflicts over what the subaltern thinks are less about getting at the truth of the matter than they are about fighting for turf, for market share. Political professionals who genuinely understand the subaltern might plausibly know how to politically activate it. When members of the subaltern are activated, they consume political media, and so professionals who can activate parts of the subaltern make effective campaign strategists. They can write popular books. They can start popular TV shows, YouTube channels, and podcasts. The wider the gulf between the political professionals and the subaltern, the more valuable this subaltern whispering becomes. And it only grows wider, as economic inequality deepens and the professional's university language becomes more obscure and less accessible. The guys in the hot air balloons. I want to close this chapter with an extended metaphor. Let us think of political professionals as guys in hot air balloons. Political professionals are given hot air balloons by the oligarchs who support them. The balloons allow the professionals to fly high above the subaltern Americans, who are stuck on the ground. As the professionals have taken off in their balloons, things have grown increasingly desperate on the ground. A host of disasters afflict the ground bound. There are fires and floods and attacks by every manner of wild beast. Daily life becomes harder and more stressful as the subaltern contends with all these things. From their balloons, the professionals claim they can see safe places where the subaltern might go. The professionals try to lead the subaltern to these places, calling down to them from their balloons, directing them first one way, then another. At first, they try to stay close enough to the ground to be heard. Some even stay low enough to see the dangers in detail, to give highly relevant, practical advice. If they don't fly too high, they can hear a shout now and then from the ground. They are not part of the conversation down there, but they can hear snippets. The more members of the subaltern a professional manages to lead, the more rewards the professional receives from the oligarchs. They get nicer balloons, with additional amenities and comforts. There's an incentive to talk to more people at once, to promise bigger and bolder things. In an effort to spot more inspiring places to go, the professionals start to raise their balloons higher. As they go higher, they hear less of the conversation on the ground, and they no longer see the dangers in any detail. As they spend more time in the sky, the conditions on the ground no longer seem real to them. The fate of the subaltern becomes an abstract thing, not a pressing concern. The perks the oligarchs offer, on the other hand, seem very real. Before long, the professionals will say anything to get the subaltern to follow. They will pretend to see safe places where there are new forms of danger, and they will often put the subaltern in harm's way. But as long as they maintain a following, they continue to receive more perks. Increasingly, they do not even bother to look at the ground. They are too high up to see much of anything down there, anyway. Instead, they look at one another's balloons, noticing the amenities others have that they have not yet won for themselves. They become increasingly obsessed with flying higher than the rest, with seeing further. As they go higher, it becomes harder for the subaltern to hear them. They drift into the clouds, and lose their touch. The oligarchs are untroubled by this. They move on to younger, less experienced professionals who have not yet flown too high to be of use. Increasingly, professionals accept the balloons because they themselves are desperate to escape conditions on the ground. Increasingly, a hot air balloon from an oligarch is the only way to escape the ground's dangers. And once a professional accepts a hot air balloon, the experience of being in the sky begins to do its work. Slowly but surely, the fate of the subaltern becomes abstract. The appeal of the perks asserts itself. Try as they might, the professionals cannot use their balloons to help the people on the ground. Slowly, the balloons themselves become associated with the indifference and cruelty they engender in the professionals who fly in them. The subaltern comes to view balloons as wicked, fell things. Now the subaltern becomes suspicious, and it is only through the most insidious forms of deception that a professional can lead the subaltern and enjoy the perks. Some professionals who have only recently received their balloons still care too much for those on the ground. They refuse to participate in the deceptions. To make an example of them, the oligarchs pop their balloons. This pruning of the professional class is highly effective. The surviving rump professionals get the memo. In the end, the subaltern comes to view the professionals as demons, as corrupted spirits, sent down by satanic oligarchs to ensorcel them. The mistrust becomes so deep that it becomes impossible for the professionals to be seen to do anything else. And yet, no one dares challenge this system. In other places the dangers are thought to be even worse, and the balloonists are thought to be even more cruel. So, there is no revolution, no grand moment of revolt. Instead, the subaltern expends most of its time and energy doing its level best to avoid the dangers on the ground, to find safe places to hide for a while, to preserve its sanity in the face of new ruses. The further this goes, the more the subaltern despairs about actualizing the powers of citizenship. It accepts that democracy is the only political system, and that democracy works in this frustrating, dissatisfying way. Instead of trying to replace or reform democracy, a despairing subaltern tries to avoid wasting its energy on politics. It hopes to keep that energy for other purposes, among these the 4 F's. And so, democracy invents more insidious ways to extract political energy, in part by interfering with the 4 F's, destabilizing these spaces and harassing the Americans who try to retreat into them. Instead of a way of self-actualizing, participating in democratic politics becomes a burden, a menace, a thing to fear and to avoid at great cost. Democracy becomes a succubus, a vampire, a leech on the energies of those unfortunate enough to remain subject to it. In this way, democracy passes from a system built upon hope and fear to one of outright despair. 1. 6. What if this book is wrong? Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Keywords: despair, capital mobility, democracy, reform, revolution. This is a bleak book. I'll not deny it. It is, however, not the first of its kind. In the post-war era, social theorists Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer argued that a narrow, instrumental reason penetrates every part of society, including academia and the arts. Everything is a means to an end, and that end is progress, narrowly conceived in economic and technological terms. The intrinsic value of things and people is lost. Everything is judged based on its ability to contribute to progress. All other values are subsumed under it, rendered invisible. Insofar as these other forms of value are recognized, they are often dismissed or denied. A person's value is taken to be their ability to contribute to progress and nothing more. As this way of thinking spreads, it becomes difficult to criticize it. It excludes the values that would form the basis of a critique. So, it should come as no surprise that when Adorno and Horkheimer levied this critique at post-war societies, they were accused of failing to contribute to progress. Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, put this bluntly: Marx's own condemnation of our society makes sense. For Marx's theory contains the promise of a better future. But the theory becomes vacuous and irresponsible if this promise is withdrawn, as it is by Adorno and Horkheimer. It is not as if Adorno and Horkheimer had no positive suggestions. By recognizing the character of the existing society and rediscovering the values that instrumental reason excludes, we make it possible to think about society in a new way. 3-6. This new way of thinking may not immediately issue in any particular concrete political strategy. But it helps us evaluate the prospects of new political strategies that may become available to us. At the very least, it helps us avoid wasting our time with approaches that won't work. If we are able to value the things that instrumental reason excludes, we conserve important aspects of the human experience from annihilation. This was not enough for Jürgen Habermas, Adorno's student and assistant. Habermas argued that if Adorno was right about the degree to which instrumental reason permeates society, Adorno himself would have been unable to formulate a critique of it. If instrumental reason can be critiqued, it can be politically challenged. A similar sort of argument could be made here. I have made the case that economic changes have driven the United States into a chronic legitimacy crisis. I claim that the crisis cannot be solved with reform or revolution, and that it can only terminate in political despair. If I am lucky, you might reply to me the way Habermas replied to Adorno. You might say that if these problems with American democracy can be articulated and sympathized with, this means there is potential to reform democracy or replace it. If I am unlucky, you might reply to me the way Popper replied to Adorno, accusing me of enacting an irresponsible assault on our political system and on forms of political action that many people value deeply. I think I owe the Habermasian critique a response. That is the function of this chapter. I will consider two principal ways this book could be wrong. 1. It could be possible to address the underlying economic causes of the chronic legitimacy crisis through the existing American democratic system. 2. It could be possible to conceive of a compelling alternative to democracy as we know it. We'll start with the first and then move to the second. Political prospects for would-be reformers. In Chapter 2, I argued extensively against the possibility of addressing the economic sources of resentment through the existing American political factions. I heavily criticized the existing left, center, and right. But I did not consider the possibility of creating an alternative to the three factions. Could there be a fourth faction? To succeed, a fourth faction would need both a political strategy for winning elections and an economic plan to substantively alleviate the sources of resentment. It is difficult to start anything new in the United States, politically. The barriers to entry into the American political system are sizable. Sometimes it is argued that only a third party can break the duopoly of the two-party system, 8-11. But the two parties have extent fundraising networks. Third parties operate at a heavy financial disadvantage. Money is especially critical in American politics because of the very large number of offices that must be won to change anything, and because successful candidates must wage two campaigns. One in the general election, and one in the primary. A third party could, in theory, cut political costs by picking its candidates without a primary campaign. But in the United States, alternative mechanisms for picking candidates are often prohibited by law. Most U.S. states have laws that require all political parties to use primary mechanisms. The two parties have framed the primary system as an essential part of the democratic process, and parties that try to do without it not only risk appearing undemocratic, they will struggle to get ballot access. Despite all the appeals to the democratic character of the primary process, in practice, oligarchs and corporations penetrate the system easily. Some states have open primaries, in which all voters are eligible. In others, voters just have to register as supporters of the party in question. There's no need for primary voters to pay for a membership or to perform any services to the party in exchange for the right to vote in its primaries. Because it's relatively easy for voters to sign up to vote in any given party primary, parties have little control over who votes in their own primaries. Oligarchs and corporations can use their wealth to sponsor outsider candidates. They can mobilize new voters to sign up to vote for those candidates in primaries. In these ways, they can flood parties with candidates and voters who don't share the party's values or orientation. The primaries allow oligarchs and corporations to effectively pay to change the composition of third parties, usurping control over them. At the same time, the primary system also aids the two parties in creating the perception that voters do not have to vote for third parties to pressure the two parties to change. In 2016, over 57 million people voted in the Democratic and Republican Party primaries, while fewer than 8 million voted for third-party candidates in the general election. Since the inception of the modern primary system following the 1968 presidential election, no third-party presidential candidate has won any electoral votes. The last third-party candidate to win a Senate race won in 1970. Independents have had more success than third-party candidates, operating without the aid of party infrastructure. But independents do not win enough seats to be a power base in their own right, and without a party there is little to unite them or coordinate them. Under the existing rules, a third party cannot be a vehicle for a fourth faction. Some respond to this situation by arguing for electoral reforms that lower the barrier to entry for third parties, 13 to 15. The two parties have strong political reasons to resist such reforms. But even if these reforms are enacted, it is not obvious that they will help. European countries with alternative voting systems do end up with a larger number of competitive political parties, but they also get coalition governments. Parties that want to change things end up in coalitions with parties that don't. In those coalitions, the status quo tends to prevail, especially on contentious economic issues. It is often assumed that continental European countries have seen inequality rise more slowly because they have political systems that work better than the American and British systems. But economic inequality rose more slowly in Europe in large part because the Reagans and Thatchers of Europe struggled to establish stable governing majorities. They are forced to proceed much more slowly because of the degree to which European electoral systems stifle change. So, while electoral reforms slowed the unraveling of the post-war settlement in Europe, this does not mean they can be used to rapidly construct a replacement for it in the United States. Adding more competitive political parties does not automatically improve policy dynamism. In American history, the most successful third parties have been those parties that have displaced one of the two contending parties. In the 19th century, the Republican Party displaced the Whig Party. If we introduce electoral reform, more parties will proliferate, but they will struggle to displace the others. This will only accentuate the vetocratic features of the existing system. The three factions that currently dominate American politics have no capacity to meaningfully challenge the growing power of oligarchs and corporations. Electoral reform would allow a fourth faction to compete in elections, but it would compel that fourth faction to form coalitions with the existing factions. Those factions are useless. They need to be displaced, not accommodated within the framework of European-style coalitions. Third parties cannot get off the ground without electoral reform, but electoral reform makes it impossible for third parties to displace the existing factions and challenge the dominant economic paradigm. This looks like a catch-22. We could instead attempt to eliminate the primary system. This would empower the existing party elites, most of whom are part of the centrist faction. That could increase the incentive for supporters of both the left and the right to support third parties. But for precisely these reasons, the elimination of the primary system is unlikely. Voters do not want to empower the party elites. They think that primaries give them a democratic check on the power of those elites. The party elites, for their part, understand very well that the primaries help the two parties secure public support for the candidates the parties nominate. They adopted the primary system because it possesses these advantages, and they are unlikely to abandon it now, when it has become so thoroughly associated with the American democratic process. Here's another option. We could create a party that is not a party. While parties have to use primaries to choose their candidates, it remains legal for non-party organizations to recruit candidates to run in the primaries of the two parties. Organizations like Brand New Congress, the Justice Democrats, and Our Revolution recruit people to run as left-wing insurgents in Democratic primaries. Individual oligarchs, like the late Sheldon Adelson, are major players in primary campaigns for both centrist candidates and right-wing insurgents, 17-18. But, as we discussed in Chapter 2, primary insurgents from the left and the right have been unable to penetrate very deeply, severely limiting what both the left and the right are able to accomplish. Part of the trouble is that the left and the right are each committed to one of the two parties. The left only runs its candidates in Democratic primaries, while the right only runs its candidates in Republican primaries. Because of this partisan commitment, the left can only cater to Democratic primary voters, and the right can only cater to Republican primary voters. This forces the two factions to develop cultural positions that are highly attractive to the voters, who participate in their respective parties' primaries, but have little crossover appeal. The harder an insurgent tries to win the primary, the more difficult it is for that insurgent to win a competitive general election. Insurgents are also often short on funds. They don't want to have to pay for two competitive campaigns. So, insurgent candidates tend to run in areas of the country where the general election is not competitive, hoping that they can win the primary and that this will automatically deliver a general election win. This limits the national appeal of the left and the right, making it impossible for either to win enough seats to do anything bold. What if there were an organization that recruited candidates to run in both Democratic and Republican Party primaries? This para-party would operate like a political party, but it would not run candidates on its own ballot line. It would therefore have no legal obligation to choose its candidates through primaries of its own. It could use candidate selection committees to pick candidates to run in the primaries of the two parties. Because the para-party would have no commitment to either party, the para-party could run multiple candidates for the same races, increasing its odds. For a given congressional race, it could run candidates in both the Democratic and Republican primaries, giving itself an improved chance of having at least one of its candidates make it to the general election. This strategy would incentivize the para-party to contest seats in which both of the two parties are competitive, and that would incentivize the para-party to be more culturally inclusive than the organizations of the existing left and right, potentially broadening its national appeal. The para-party's candidates could agree on a suite of economic policies while disagreeing about cultural issues. This would free the candidates running in Democratic primaries to tack progressive, and it would free the candidates running in Republican primaries to tack conservative. But, once elected, the Democratic and Republican members of the para-party would work together on economic policy. They could present large-scale economic changes as common sense, bipartisan reforms. Over time, the para-party would set out to capture the center of American politics, displacing both the Democratic and Republican Party elites in the service of a new economic consensus. This would still, however, be very expensive. The para-party would have to contest an enormous number of primaries. Most of the organizations that donate to political campaigns have rigid cultural commitments that force them to focus their energies on a single party. They are unable to support an inclusive, pluralist approach. The organizations that do donate to candidates from both parties tend to be affiliated with corporate lobbies. They donate to both parties precisely because it is important to them to ensure that both parties support the economic status quo. By donating to both parties, they ensure that their economic views are treated as a form of common sense. Their strategy could be replicated in the service of economic change, but only if alternative sources of funding can be found. Could the labor movement provide this support? The labor movement in the United States is weak, and where it is strong it is led by union bosses who are thoroughly embedded in the Democratic Party and who firmly support the existing Democratic Party establishment. 1920. Outside of the unions, the workers increasingly lack the time, energy, and money to build a fourth faction. They may already be too subaltern to provide the foundation for something new. There are some who argue that it may be possible to build new unions. 21 to 24. Many of the people who make this argument are interested in a third party or in exclusively contesting Democratic primaries. Some bank their arguments on the idea that President Biden will push through some version of the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, but Biden has not done this and does not appear likely to do it. 25-26. Even if Biden were able and willing to get it done, it could lead to more unions that are firmly hitched to the Democratic Party establishment's wagon. Then there are the problems with service sector unions we discussed back in Chapter 1. Unions have much more leverage when they can shut down factories. Even when they had that leverage in the 1970s, oligarchs and corporations were able to outmuscle and defeat them. Ultimately, it may not be possible to raise money for a para-party without the assistance of the oligarchs themselves. This may seem counterintuitive. As I've pitched it, the fourth faction is interested in reducing economic inequality, revising the economic system to reduce the wealth and power of oligarchs and corporations. Why would oligarchs help weaken the oligarchs? The interests of individual oligarchs do not necessarily coincide with the interests of the oligarchs as a class. Individual oligarchs can strengthen themselves by betraying their own class. The point was put straightforwardly by social critic Barbara Ehrenreich. To anyone who is not a vulgar Marxist, it goes without saying that members of the new class, or of the entire professional middle class, can and will write anything they like, within the limits of marketability, including diatribes against their own brethren. Class treason is an option at all socioeconomic levels, from the blue-collar man who becomes a security guard employed to harass workers, to the heirs of capitalist fortunes who become donors to left-wing causes. During periods when economic stress is extremely severe and the working class is in no real organizational state to do very much at all about it, economic change can only happen with the help of class traders. As the professional class is pruned and weakened, it becomes harder to imagine any effective form of politics that is not supported by oligarchs. There are historical precedents for this. Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's friend and patron, came from a rich family. In the late Roman Republic, two aristocratic brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to redistribute land from wealthy families like their own to the Roman poor. They came close enough to achieving their aims that both of them were killed in riots orchestrated by the Roman elite. Tiberius Gracchus died in 133 BC, while Gaius Gracchus died under similar circumstances more than a decade later, in 121. There are risks to democracy associated with having oligarchs play critical roles. Sometimes oligarchs take leading roles because they hope to use worker movements to capture sovereign power for themselves. These figures are often called demagogues. Because this is what Julius Caesar was accused of trying to do, it is sometimes associated with Caesarism. It must however be acknowledged that most of the Romans who called Caesar a demagogue were themselves oligarchs. Roman oligarchs opposed Caesar not just because they considered him a threat to the Roman Republic but because they also worried he might imitate the reforms of the Gracchi, 28-30. By accusing Caesar of trying to destroy Republican liberty, these oligarchs could oppose his economic reforms. In the same way, oligarchs who try to help a fourth faction would be accused of trying to distort or destroy democracy. The para-party would be framed as an effort to subvert not just the two-party system, but democracy itself. In a chronic legitimacy crisis in which the meaning of democracy is contested, these arguments will not fall on deaf ears. But two can play at this game. The para-party could just as easily accuse the oligarchs and their supporters of twisting American democracy into a form of plutocracy, 31-34. After all, it is already the case that oligarchs donate heavily to both parties to ensure that their economic interests are protected. When the meaning of democracy is contested, it can be contested from multiple directions at once. If the para-party has enough financial and organizational support from a renewed labor movement, oligarchic class traders, or some combination thereof, and if its economic proposals speak to the needs and felt resentments of the American subaltern, establishment politicians and political professionals could plausibly struggle to keep its candidates from winning elections. But this leads us to another question. What would the fourth faction propose economically? Even if the funds can be found to build a competitive para-party, the para-party's candidates would need substantive policy accomplishments to keep voters politically activated. Otherwise, disappointed voters will politically deactivate, and any initial electoral success will evaporate quickly. Intermediary steps. Even if the fourth faction is enormously successful, politically, it cannot secure a governing majority for itself in a single election. Only a minority of Senate seats are available in any given election cycle, and there are too many different offices that need to be won for the fourth faction to win enough of them all in one go. For some time, it will only possess a minority of congressional seats. At this stage, it would be strong enough to win some elections, but not strong enough to enact its economic agenda. The public, however, will expect the fourth faction to do something useful with the seats it does possess. If it does nothing, its credibility with the electorate will erode, and it will find it difficult to continue expanding in subsequent elections. Therefore, the fourth faction would need to find some economic measures it can fight for even when it has a limited presence at the federal level. Beyond this, it would need to find economic measures it can fight for at the state and local levels. It would even need to find economic measures it can fight for when it has only a limited presence in state legislatures. This is no trivial task. Oligarchs and corporations have far more leverage over the policies of municipalities and states than they do the federal government. This is for the very simple reason that it is much easier to move jobs and investment from one U.S. city or state to another than it is to move jobs and investment abroad. This means that many policies that could work at the federal level will perform poorly at the state or local levels. If the fourth faction's state and local politicians respond to these incentives and make economic policy in a conventional way, they will fail to differentiate themselves. Enthusiasm for the fourth faction will dissipate. If the state and local politicians defy these incentives and try policies that cannot work at the state and local levels, their failures will have a discrediting effect on the whole movement. This means that at the earlier stages, the fourth faction's politicians will need to pursue economic policies that are different from those they would pursue at the later stages. In whichever areas a fourth faction has the greatest initial electoral success, it will be necessary to find and implement context-sensitive economic policies. Those policies should work to establish the movement's credibility by reducing the cost of living and improving the quality of public services in a manner consistent with the limited powers that state and local governments possess. For example, state and local governments have a lot of straightforward influence over land use. The rising cost of housing is a key contributor to the rising cost of living. While the housing crisis is associated with cities, it is becoming a problem in rural areas as well. Land use is handled in different ways in different parts of the country, and different legal and economic contexts will call for different specific policy approaches. Branches of the fourth faction will need to carefully study the characteristics of their local areas and choose policies that are appropriate. This is a lot to ask. Even if the fourth faction is savvy about picking fights it can win, it will not always be in position to implement the policies that are necessary to solidify the loyalty of voters. If it only has a small handful of seats in Congress, state legislatures, or city councils, it often just won't be able to deliver anything immediately. In these situations, it would have to find other ways to differentiate itself from the other factions. As we discussed in Chapter 2, when the left and the right are stymied, they drift into forms of cultural politics in a bid to prop up voter enthusiasm. But this cultural politics is divisive and further impedes their ability to build support. The fourth faction would need to find other ways to hold voter interest. Instead of pivoting away from economic issues, the fourth faction could explicitly identify the specific politicians who stand in the way of its policies. Often the politicians of the left and the right are reluctant to cause too much trouble for the centrist establishment because of their loyalty to either the Democrats or the Republicans, respectively. Because left-wing politicians are unwilling to consider running as Republicans, they remain dependent on the Democratic Party leadership for career advancement, and this makes them reluctant to do anything that would cause the party leadership serious embarrassment. The same goes for right-wing politicians who are unwilling to consider running as Democrats. In most cases, the politicians of the left and right are not just unwilling to run on the opposite party ballot line, they are unable. The cultural stances they have taken have ensured they can never cross over. Because they cannot credibly threaten to exit their respective parties, the politicians of the left and right have limited leverage when they negotiate with the politicians of the center. As Hirschman points out, without a credible threat of exit, the force of voice is diminished. If the fourth faction's politicians are loyal principally to the para-party rather than to the parties whose ballot lines they use, they can more effectively oppose the establishment in both its Democratic and Republican forms. Their loyalty to the para-party needs to be secured. To start, the para-party must have enough resources to adequately support the campaigns of the politicians associated with it. But if the para-party starts winning elections, party discipline will become important. Often frustrated politicians of the left and the right move to the center in exchange for career opportunities they cannot enjoy as fringe opposition figures. Once they defect, the credibility they build up with voters by playing up their left-wing or right-wing bona fides makes them valuable assets to the two parties. The closer the fourth faction comes to success, the harder the party establishments will work to get its politicians to defect. Therefore, the politicians associated with the para-party must make clear and binding commitments about the economic policies they will pursue in office and the specific political strategies they will use to advance those policies. The para-party must make examples of the politicians who break their commitments, challenging them in primaries and, if necessary, using the opposite party's ballot line to defeat them. This is an area where the existing left is sorely lacking. It is easy for left-wing members of Congress to claim that they are unable to do much to advance left-wing economic policy goals, because there are very few of them. But while it is true that the left is numerically frustrated, these left-wing members of Congress are not doing everything they can. They backed Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker of the House, without extracting meaningful concessions in return. Many of them voted to impose a contract that denies railway workers sick pay. They get away with this behavior because the left-wing organizations that drafted these politicians to run and supported their campaigns have not clearly established what policies they expect left-wing politicians to advance and what strategies they expect left-wing politicians to follow when they are in the minority. There are no clear criteria for evaluating whether left-wing politicians are loyal to the left-wing organizations that sponsor them, and there are no formal mechanisms for disciplining left-wing politicians who are disloyal. Because of this, the professional left constantly has to debate whether its elected officials are actually left-wing. 38-42. Individual professionals form their own judgments. When the professional left wrongfully defends its politicians, the left is deceived into supporting new forms of centrism. When the professional left wrongfully condemns its politicians, the left's credibility with voters is damaged without cause. The fourth faction must avoid this trap by establishing clearer expectations for its politicians. It must be obvious what constitutes disloyalty. The consequences of disloyalty must be clear. The para-party must have a highly specific platform, and it must update that platform regularly. The platform cannot be a mere campaign document, it must meaningfully commit the para-party's politicians to specific policies and strategies. Branches of the para-party operating in specific states and localities will need binding platforms of their own, specific to their circumstances. Economic endgames. Suppose that all this is successfully managed, and the fourth faction secures enough power at the federal level to attempt to revise the global economic system. How would it go about doing that? Two broad types of economic policy program are possible. The United States could adopt a multilateral strategy, in which it works together with other countries to redesign substantial parts of the global economic system. This might involve some combination of global wealth taxes, robust global minimum tax rates, global minimum wage laws, global economic rights, and so on. Alternatively, the United States could adopt a unilateral strategy, in which it uses tariffs, sanctions, and capital controls to protect its workers. These two options were broadly laid out by French economist Thomas Piketty nearly a decade ago. In Chapter 1, we discussed some of the obstacles in the way of both options, and in Chapter 2, we discussed some of the ways the three factions have unsuccessfully engaged with those obstacles. But could a fourth faction try a different approach? If it is possible to revise the system in a multilateral way, this is much preferred. Multilateral revision limits the scale of economic disruption. If there is too much economic disruption too quickly, living standards will fall in the near term. Even if the economic changes raise living standards in the long run, near-term reductions can be politically fatal. It's hard to win elections when inflation is high, when unemployment is high, or when the economy is stagnating or contracting. But a multilateral strategy requires other countries to willingly cooperate. To be sure, the United States remains a very powerful and influential country. If the United States wanted to change the rules, the mere fact of this might cause some governments to shift positions and entertain the possibility. But this willingness cannot be taken for granted. In some countries, cooperation will likely depend on electoral outcomes. The fourth faction would need to form alliances with parties and movements in those countries. Securing the cooperation of different countries will require different political strategies, because different countries have different political systems. Some countries are not democracies, and if these countries are not interested in cooperating, it may be very difficult to bring them around. There are also many different procedural forms of democracy. In many democratic countries, the electoral system makes it difficult to elect a government that can credibly commit to quite serious economic change. Minority governments and coalition governments may struggle to effectively cooperate with the United States, even in cases where they profess an interest in doing so. It was for this sort of reason that in 2017, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's Unsubmissive France party proposed two plans to change France's relationship with the European Union. The first plan, Plan A, called for France to use a multilateral approach to renegotiate the European treaties. But because it was always likely that France would face resistance to any multilateral bid to make radical changes, Mélenchon also proposed a unilateral strategy as a backup. This strategy, Plan B, called for France to unilaterally withdraw from the European treaties. It was this commitment to a unilateral Plan B that marked Mélenchon out as a radical figure, even though he himself had been a member of France's mainstream center-left party until he was nearly 60 years old. The credible threat of a unilateral strategy would aid the multilateral strategy, insofar as it would increase France's leverage in negotiations. But the credible threat of a unilateral strategy also makes Mélenchon appear to lack economic credibility, because the economic costs of actually following a unilateral strategy are enormous. President Trump was not even willing to carry a unilateral strategy through to its conclusions, because the cost of severing supply chains is so steep. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine have illustrated the economic and political costs of even a partial, fleeting disruption to world trade. The exploding cost of living in the United States has badly hampered the Biden administration. Unilateral strategies also come with cultural costs. Politicians that propose a unilateral strategy are accused of courting nationalists, xenophobes, racists, and various other deplorables. Mélenchon and Unsubmissive France were repeatedly accused of Islamophobia, of trying to make common cause with right-wing populists, and of legitimizing conservative grievances about a loss of French national unity, 46-50. In recent years, Mélenchon has watered Plan B down to improve Unsubmissive France's economic credibility and its electoral odds. He no longer calls for unilateral withdrawal from European treaties, instead proposing to have France ignore some of the rules, selectively. In an agreement with the pro-European Socialist Party, Unsubmissive France explicitly rules out the possibility of leaving the European Union. The government that we will form for this legislature cannot have as its policy the exit from the Union, nor its disintegration, nor the end of the single currency. But by taking this, less aggressive, approach, Mélenchon ensures that if he ever wins the presidency and does attempt to renegotiate the framework of the European Union, he will lack a credible threat of exit. If France lacks the credible threat of exit, its attempts to use voice to change the EU will carry less weight. At the same time, if Mélenchon were to resume calls for a more aggressive version of Plan B, that would diminish his odds of winning the presidency in the first place. Multilateralism is unlikely to succeed without the credible threat of unilateralism. Yet the credible threat of unilateralism destroys the economic credibility necessary to win elections and get a chance to pursue multilateralism in the first instance. Again, we have what looks like a catch-22. In Chapter 1, I suggested that it might be impossible to campaign on a unilateral strategy. I argued it could only be implemented as a surprise measure. To impose capital controls without risking capital flight, the president would have to spring them on the oligarchs as a surprise, without campaigning for them or establishing any democratic mandate for them. It is possible that the fourth faction could run on multilateralism, deny any interest in unilateralism during the campaign, and then pull out the threat of unilateralism in response to failing negotiations. But because no democratic mandate would exist for unilateralism, it would be difficult to convince other countries that the threat of unilateralism is credible. Alternatively, the fourth faction could attempt to engineer a geopolitical crisis that makes the threat of unilateralism appear credible all of a sudden. Consider for instance the sanctions that the Biden administration deployed against Russia. President Biden certainly did not campaign on sanctioning Russia. Oligarchs and corporations had no reason to think that Biden's election would mean that sanctions were coming. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the decision to impose sanctions appeared to be a necessary response to Russian behavior, dictated by events. It appeared to many as if there were no choice but to impose them. The economic fallout from the sanctions has been very serious, and as oil prices have risen, the Biden administration has paid a price for the sanctions in the polls. But even so, the Biden administration has been able to force many countries and companies to quickly reconfigure their economic relationship with Russia, and it has been able to do this without establishing any democratic mandate for the policy. What if President Biden had been determined to impose these sanctions on Russia from the beginning? If Biden had run on sanctioning Russia before Russia invaded Ukraine, there would have been a lot of opposition, not just from individual oligarchs and firms, but from the European countries that relied upon Russia for oil and gas. It was the invasion of Ukraine that changed this situation. The European countries agreed to participate in the sanctions only because Russia invaded Ukraine. If, hypothetically, the Biden administration were determined to sanction Russia from the start, it would have been politically necessary to manufacture a crisis, to goad Russia into invading Ukraine, to create a justification for the sanctions. It could have done this by, for instance, suggesting that NATO membership for Ukraine was not just possible, but imminent. I am, for the record, in no way suggesting the Biden administration actually did any of this. But it is something it could have done, if it were determined to damage the Russian economy. In a similar way, President Bush did not campaign on invading Iraq when he ran for president in 2000. But the September 11th attacks made it politically possible to invade Iraq, even without the support of allies like France and Germany. The crisis put unilateral options on the table that were previously off the table. Bush did not purposefully orchestrate the September 11th attacks to create an opportunity to invade Iraq. But conspiracy theorists were able to convince a significant number of people that he might have done so because of the degree to which the crisis expanded what was politically possible for the administration. A fourth faction could orchestrate a foreign policy crisis that allows it to implement, or to credibly threaten to implement, a unilateral economic strategy. To give one very straightforward example of how this might be done, suppose the United States were unable to come to terms with China about how to restructure the global economy, multilaterally. China is a very important trading partner. It would be deeply costly, on both an economic and a political level, for the United States to revise the global economic system without Chinese support. To create an excuse to pursue a unilateral policy in the face of those costs, the United States could suggest that it is imminently going to recognize the independence of Taiwan. It could bait China into an invasion of Taiwan, and use a Chinese invasion of Taiwan as a justification for imposing sanctions, and for pushing other countries to impose sanctions. If China failed to take the bait, it could press the issue further, by actually recognizing Taiwan. More radically, it could even suggest that Taiwan might choose to become part of the United States. Amazingly, there is a fringe movement that is committed to this idea, and it does from time to time attract real attention, 53 to 56. By encouraging Taiwan to seek independence or statehood and by framing China as an opponent of Taiwanese self-determination, the United States could force the situation to come to a head. This idea should strike you as totally mad. If this were tried, it would very likely provoke a war between the United States and China. It would be a deeply irresponsible thing to do. If this is what it takes to create a political opportunity to pursue unilateralism, unilateralism should not be pursued, even if the threat of unilateralism is necessary to make multilateralism a success. We could imagine a situation where, after China invades Taiwan, it is cut out of the international system, and the United States and its allies create a new international economic order without it. In this way, unilateral action to expel China from the order could facilitate multilateral action with the countries that remain within it. But to do this, we would have to countenance the possibility of war, enormous economic disruption, and suffering on a grand scale. It is for this reason that Walter Scheidel cautions us about trying to solve the unsolvable problem. For Scheidel, it is not that we strictly speaking can't reduce economic inequality. It's that reducing it involves countenancing things we should not countenance. Large-scale redistribution is possible, But Scheidel's four horsemen, war, revolution, state collapse, and pandemics, are invariably necessary to bring it about. It could be possible for a fourth faction to reduce economic inequality in the United States through the existing political institutions. But the United States would need to either secure China's support or risk a war with China over the issue. Could China choose to cooperate? Chinese support seems, at first blush, unlikely, because of the degree to which China benefits from the existing system. It has been able to develop its export sector in large part because its wages are much lower than wages in the United States or Europe. But this has been slowly changing, as economic growth in China has pushed wages up. Michael Pettis, a professor of finance who has watched China closely for many years, argues that, to continue growing, China must increase the purchasing power of its workers and become a consumer-driven economy. He argues that there is no need for a trade war between the United States and China, because American and Chinese workers would benefit from the same policies. Together with Matthew Klein, he writes, "There is no economic conflict between America and China as countries. The Chinese people are not the enemy. Rather, there is a conflict between classes within China that has spilled over into the United States. Systematic transfers of wealth from Chinese workers to Chinese elites distorts the Chinese economy by strangling purchasing power and subsidizing production at the expense of consumption. That, in turn, distorts the global economy by creating gluts of manufactured goods and by bidding up the prices of stocks, bonds, and real estate. Chinese underconsumption destroys jobs elsewhere, while inflated asset values lead to devastating cycles of booms, busts, and debt crises. China's policies do not just hurt Americans, they also harm ordinary Chinese workers and retirees. Chinese workers are underpaid relative to what they produce, and they are taxed too much. They are unable to access goods and services they ought to be able to afford. Some combination of falling employment and rising indebtedness outside of China was the inevitable consequence. Americans have borne much of these costs, thanks in part to the collusion of U.S. business interests with Chinese politicians and industrialists. But can the Chinese government, dominated by the very elites Pettis condemns, recognize the need to adapt its economic policy? Pettis himself has recently expressed skepticism on this point. The constituencies that have benefited disproportionately from the older model, and have amassed a disproportionate share of political power in the process, are likely to block an adjustment to this model that requires them to absorb a disproportionate share of the adjustment costs. Put differently, it is easy to figure out the arithmetic of the rebalancing adjustment, but it is difficult to absorb the political consequences. If we follow Pettis, the political obstacles to economic change in China are substantial, just as the political obstacles to economic change in the United States are substantial. With neither political system exhibiting a great deal of economic policy dynamism, it would take enormous luck to have both countries ready to pursue a multilateral economic strategy together. The fact that the workers in both countries share a common economic interest does not imply that they can both acquire the political power necessary to realize those shared interests. Even if they can both acquire this power, there is no reason to think that they will acquire this power at the same time. If the fourth faction achieves political power just a few years before a sister movement in China does the same, the fourth faction will experience multilateralism as impossible. It would have to take drastic unilateral steps or abandon its pursuit of large-scale economic reform. Like two ships passing in the night, American and Chinese reformers are very likely to miss the opportunity to work with one another. If this all sounds like a lot, it's because it is. Even if we try very hard to build a fourth faction that is adapted to American economic circumstances and American democratic procedures, there are still many ways it can fail. Over the course of this chapter, the following 10 discrete problems have come up. 1. The primary system drags American politicians into culture war issues, and it also makes it difficult to establish new competitive parties. 2. Changing the electoral system would allow new competitive parties to form, but it would also make it difficult for new parties to secure enough seats to pass economic reforms. 3. A para-party could run hand-picked candidates in both parties' primaries at the same time, but this would be expensive. A resurgent labor movement could fund a para-party, but the labor movement is in bad shape and the Biden administration is not delivering the help it promised. 4. We could fund a para-party with the help of class trader oligarchs, but even if we can find some, they will face accusations of demagoguery and Caesarism. 5. If the fourth faction nonetheless starts to succeed, it needs to find economic policies it can implement at the state and local levels to build credibility and maintain electoral momentum, even though the economic influence of states and localities is limited. 6. If the fourth faction cannot find economic policies it can implement, it will need to maintain voter interest without regressing back into cultural politics. 7. As it grows, the fourth faction will need to secure the loyalty of its politicians through some form of party discipline. 8. If the fourth faction achieves enough power to move forward with substantial economic reforms, it will need to secure the cooperation of other countries with very different political systems. 9. In the face of obstacles to a multilateral strategy, the fourth faction may need to pursue, or to credibly threaten to pursue, a unilateral strategy. But committing to unilateralism, even as a plan B, makes it difficult to win elections, because unilateralism has severe economic consequences. 10. A unilateral strategy can be pursued in response to a major foreign policy crisis, but this entails taking on board the risks associated with that foreign policy crisis, and those risks may be too severe to countenance. These are just the 10 problems I've spotted and discussed. As you've been reading, you may very well have thought of more obstacles. You may have caught me in moments where I've been too hopeful and rationalized away difficulties. The very act of trying to develop a strategy of my own encourages me to paper over problems. It is much easier to sell a book that offers hope. The more I can get myself to believe in the strategy I propose, the better I will be at selling books to readers. If I want to believe there is a strategy that can work, and you also want to believe it, we can deceive each other by pretending that I have come up with a good strategy. If you help me believe that I am right, and I help you believe that I am right, together, we can blissfully waste our lives. Along the way I will make a lot of money, and you won't. Alternatives to democracy. What if this book wasn't wrong in Chapter 2, but in Chapter 3? In Chapter 3, I argued that we are in a chronic legitimacy crisis. We are stuck with a minimal level of legitimacy. This leaves us committed to democracy, but in deep disagreement over the form democracy should take. In Chapters 4 and 5, I proceeded from the assumption that we cannot drop to liminal legitimacy, and therefore Americans will be forced to find other ways of coping with the low level of legitimacy. But what if repeated disappointments finally break Americans' loyalty to democracy, pushing us to come up with an alternative kind of political system? For Etienne Balibar, there is a tension in democracies between the sense in which we are subjects of the state and the sense in which we are citizens of it. Citizens participate in political decision-making, while subjects are bound by the political decisions of others. For Balibar, there is always a sense in which the citizens remain subjects, but there is also always a sense in which the subjects remain citizens. We are always both participating in the democratic process and subject to that same process. While democratic citizens are still subjects, and therefore unable to fully actualize their citizenship, they retain the potential to undertake revolutionary action. Even when the political system does not empower citizens, they retain a latent ability to empower themselves by changing the system's fundamental character. Narratives about fundamental change are as old as political theory itself. In Plato's Republic, rising economic inequality first brings about democracy and then destroys it. Before democracy, there is oligarchy, rule by wealthy property owners. Under oligarchy, economic conditions become increasingly stressful. Economic stress drives the people to become indebted to the rich. The rich, fixated on money and pleasure, become physically and psychologically weak, and this eventually allows the debtors to rebel against their creditors and set up a democracy. The form of democracy Plato describes is radically different from our own. Offices are assigned through the drawing of lots, rather than through elections. This is one possible alternative to American democracy as we know it. Instead of holding elections, we could fill offices by picking names out of a hat. But Plato suggests this will not work out, because even in this direct democracy, 3 distinct classes form. There are the rich, the ordinary people, and then there is what Plato calls the dominant class, the part that does all the talking and acting. This part is able to squeeze some wealth out of the rich. But it shares little of this wealth with the people, instead keeping the greatest share for itself. Eventually, both the oligarchs and the people turn against the orators who make the speeches. The rich try to restore oligarchy, while the people seek the aid of a special leader. The oligarchs attempt to slay this leader, and this forces the leader to become a tyrant. Even though we do not have direct democracy, we do have a class that does all the talking, the political professionals. Like the orators in a direct democracy, the political professionals play a mediating role between the oligarchs and the subaltern. In our representative democracy, the professionals are more firmly subordinate to the oligarchs. In direct democracy, they take on the dominant political role. But on Plato's account, further empowering the talkers does not help the subaltern. Once empowered, the talkers simply become a new form of ruling elite. Political professionals often claim that the problem with America is that it is not democratic enough, 64-69. They suggest that by introducing more direct, participatory features, the American people could be empowered. But this papers over an important problem with direct democracy. There has to be some kind of public deliberation about political issues. The people who are most rhetorically skilled often find ways to rig these deliberations in their favor. These orators become the ruling class, even within an ostensibly egalitarian framework. Political philosopher Joshua Cohen is sympathetic to direct democracy, but he acknowledges the tension. More fundamentally, social complexity and scale limit the extent to which modern polities can be both deliberative and participatory. Deliberation depends on participants with sufficient knowledge and interest about the substantive issues under consideration. But on any issue, the number of individuals with such knowledge and interest is bound to be relatively small, and so the quality of deliberation will decline with the scope of participation. Of course, knowledge and interest are not fixed, and deliberation may improve both. Still, time and resource constraints make it undesirable for any particular area of public governance to be both fully deliberative and inclusively participatory. In practice, in direct democracy it is the orators that determine what counts as proper deliberation and to what degree popular participation is compatible with this. It is the orators who have the cultural and social capital to dominate the deliberations about how to structure deliberations. Theorists of direct democracy sometimes propose to avoid this problem by using citizens' juries, or participatory deliberative arrangements. In these cases, the citizens who will participate in the deliberation are picked randomly, ensuring that many of the citizens who participate in deliberations are not professionals. But these deliberative bodies do not exclude the professionals outright, and if they include some professionals, those professionals are likely to have disproportionate influence over deliberations. Even if the professionals are excluded outright, it is often argued that the deliberative bodies need to be informed, especially when they are asked to make decisions about abstract, big-picture issues. This means that someone external to the deliberative body is deciding what counts as information. This someone will, of course, be a professional, and the information the professional gives the deliberants can, of course, be designed to rig the deliberation. Often the professionals will disagree about what counts as information, and therefore they will have to form professional-dominated deliberative bodies to determine what counts. Once the professionals are deliberating about what counts as information, or as being informed, power rests firmly with them, or with those who pay them. For Plato, the people rarely participate even in direct democracy, because the orators dominate the system. Ultimately, they turn to the special leader because the special leader seems to defend their interests more effectively than the orators do. The special leader attracts negative attention from the oligarchs, and the special leader's efforts to stay alive force the special leader to resort to tyrannical acts. Plato describes the leader as a wolf. Once he really takes over a docile mob, he does not restrain himself from shedding a fellow citizen's blood. But by leveling the usual false charges and bringing people into court, he commits murder. And by blotting out a man's life, his impious tongue and lips taste kindred blood. Then he banishes and kills and drops hints about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. And after that, isn't such a man inevitably fated either to be killed by his enemies or to be a tyrant, transformed from a man into a wolf? This sounds like the critique of the demagogues and Caesar figures we discussed earlier in this chapter. Yet earlier in the Republic, Plato argues that it is not impossible for the offspring of kings or men in power to make new laws reordering their political systems. While the tyrant is irredeemably wicked, the tyrant's offspring are not beyond redemption. Could anyone claim that if such offspring are born, they must inevitably be corrupted? We agree ourselves that it is difficult for them to be saved. But that in the whole of time not one of them could be saved, could anyone contend that? It is this idea that gives rise to the vast array of special leader narratives in the history of political thought, 72 to 76. But while stories of revolutionary political change often center on one special leader, in point of fact radical change often involves multiple leaders. The philosopher Erich Hoffer argued that three distinct figures were necessary. First there are the men of words, the people who criticize the old system and run down its legitimacy. These people are intellectually skilled enough to puncture the state's legitimacy, but they are too satisfied with their written work to destroy the old system. When they do try to take political action, their love of criticism overcomes them, and they constantly undermine one another. Next come the fanatics. They are able to read critical works, but they are not creative or talented enough to contribute new ideas of their own. Their frustration drives them to act, to seek to destroy the order in which they are unable to find fulfillment. But once they overcome the old order, they struggle to settle down. They must therefore give way to the practical men of action, who focus on securing the new order by formalizing it. For Hoffer, no single individual can be perfectly well adapted for all three of these roles. But it is also rarely the case that each kind of leader willingly makes way for the next kind. Political theorists Jonathan White and Lee Epe make a similar kind of point in a different way. White and Epe observe that the kind of party that succeeds in starting a revolution is heavily disciplined and hierarchical. But, because it has these characteristics, once it succeeds, it struggles to create dynamic, inclusive political institutions. Would-be revolutionaries often respond to this dilemma by trying to ensure their parties are dynamic and inclusive from the start, but this leads to breakdowns in party discipline, preventing the party from achieving its goals. While Hoffer focuses on a procession of different kinds of leaders, White and Epe focus on a procession of different forms of organization. Like Hoffer, White and Epe emphasize that revolutionary movements and parties tend to be insufficiently dynamic. They are unable to change their leaders and procedures at pivotal moments. This inability to adapt over the course of the revolution limits the control revolutionary organizations have over the outcome of revolutions. Revolutions get stuck with the wrong leaders and wrong procedures, and this produces a kind of path dependency. For Alexis de Tocqueville, the leaders of the French Revolution became stuck on the idea that they must deliver freedom and equality. But it was impossible to establish a consensus on the definition of these ideals. Because they could not be concretely pinned down, they were constantly renegotiated. This made it impossible for the revolutionary government to credibly commit to any discrete centralized policies. The anarchy that followed caused enormous stress and disruption. As the original leaders of the revolution died out or retreated from the scene, an increasingly exhausted populace turned to despotism. But when the vigorous generation that had launched the revolution was destroyed or exhausted, as generally happens to generations that attempt such enterprises, and when, in keeping with the natural course of events of this kind, love of liberty lost heart and languished amid anarchy and popular dictatorship, and a bewildered nation began to grope after its master, the rebirth and re-establishment of absolute government proved marvelously easy. Owing to the genius of the man who was both the continuator of the revolution and its destroyer. For Tocqueville, it is not that the revolutionary movement was undynamic, it is that it was so dynamic that it lacked credibility. Its inability to commit resulted in a return to the form of government that preceded it. A revolution against representative democracy could just lead us back where we started. In Chapter 3, we discussed how very difficult it is to have a single set of democratic procedures that is simultaneously dynamic and credible. The same sets of problems apply to revolutionary movements and alternative political systems. It's difficult to establish a consensus on what democracy ought to mean, but it's even harder to establish a consensus on what politics ought to mean if we suspend agreement on democracy. When legitimacy is minimal, different people emphasize the benefits of different procedural advantages. When legitimacy is liminal, the conflict over the political system's procedural form becomes even more intense. Revolutions occur in acute moments, when there is a moment of revolt, a moment where these procedural disputes become so intractable that they are resolved through violence. Revolutions do not eliminate the problem of class conflict, and they do not eliminate procedural contestation. It is the willingness to cross into the terrain of violence that distinguishes them. At this stage, revolutionary violence has been tried, and it has a grim record, and there seems to be little appetite to return to it. But often the credible threat of revolutionary violence is the only way to force democracies to be dynamic and to respond to the economic needs of their citizens. The Soviet Union failed, but the period of mid-century leveling in the wealthy liberal democracies was aided by its lurking presence. The belief that the Soviet Union might yet succeed compelled oligarchs to make concessions to prevent the Soviet model from spreading. The threat of revolutionary violence succeeds in forcing reform because so many of representative democracy's defenders abhor violence. For political theorist Judith S. H. Clark, the final justification for liberal democracy is its capacity to limit the cruelty that otherwise pervades politics. 4. David Runciman, even when democracies are guilty of terrible crimes, the fact that they remain superficially committed to finding nonviolent solutions limits the amount of violence they can use. Politics may be inherently violent, but liberal democracies must keep up the facade that they are, in principle, beyond violence. Drawing on George Orwell, author of the dystopian novel 1984, Runciman writes, "An imperial order unconstrained by democratic or liberal hypocrisies, in which power is called by its proper name, in which the sword is always unsheathed because there is never any need to conceal it, is certainly possible. Totalitarians can afford to be sincere about power. It is out of this sincerity that we get a third quintessentially Orwellian image, to place alongside that of the unsheathed sword, and that of the young military policeman stumbling along the road in Burma, armed with only his elephant gun. The third image is of a boot, stamping on a human face forever. It is this deep-seated fear of what happens if we abandon liberal democracy that makes it so hard to imagine an alternative political system gaining the following it would need to prevail. But this same fear is what ultimately forces the political establishment to adapt and make concessions. To again use Hirschman's terms, a credible threat of revolution, of exit, is necessary for democratic voice to be effective, for democratic citizens to actualize their citizenship. Without this threat, the political capacities of the citizens wither, as the political establishment becomes fat and happy, its flanks and rear secure. Paradoxically, the future of representative democracy may very well depend on our ability to imagine enticing alternatives to it. If the democratic system cannot rediscover its dynamism unless it is threatened with the deluge, saving American democracy might require that we try, even in vain, to destroy it. But to do this, we would first need to persuade ourselves that some alternative to democracy is possible and preferable, that violence is a tool we might use, or at least credibly threaten to use. This is no easy task for the children of Fukuyama's end of history, raised to believe that every alternative to liberal democracy is totalitarianism, is communism or fascism, is Sauron or Voldemort. It would require an expansion of our political imaginarium. We would need to somehow make sense of pursuing revolution in the face of previous revolutionary failures. The Slovenian Marxist Slavoj Žižek tries to pitch failed revolutions as learning experiences. The critics of communism were thus in a sense right when they claimed that Marxian communism is an impossible fantasy. What they did not perceive is that Marxian communism, this notion of a society of unleashed productivity outside the frame of capital, was a fantasy inherent to capitalism itself, a strictly ideological fantasy of maintaining the thrust of productivity while removing the obstacles and antagonisms that are, as the sad experience of really existing capitalism demonstrates, the only possible framework for the effective material existence of a society of permanent self-enhancing productivity. This is why a revolution has to be repeated. Only the experience of catastrophe can make the revolutionary agent aware of the fateful limitation of the first attempt. For the most part, the theorists who imagine going beyond representative democracy think of adopting direct democracy, radical democracy, forms of democracy that are meant to be even more democratic. Like the Marxist who wants to get the benefits of capitalism without the drawbacks, the radical Democrat wants a democracy that can fulfill the promise of freedom and equality, that can finally impose some form of morality on the economic system. But the radical Democrat fails to recognize that morality itself is shaped by the economic incentives that structure the deliberative spaces in which political professionals fight over the definitions of democracy, liberty, equality, and representation. A radical democratic revolution would not issue in a democratic utopia, but in a technocratic regime in which political professionals compel subaltern citizens to participate in deliberative spaces they do not control, with information that the professionals have fact-checked and pre-screened. A revolution that learns from revolutionary failure would have to move beyond this kind of ersatz utopianism. Revolution cannot deliver a sanitized capitalism. It cannot deliver a democracy without hypocrisies or contradictions. A new political system would have to frame itself in different terms. It would have to make entirely different kinds of promises. It could not promise to actualize liberal ideals, to accelerate what is already present. It would have to be a perpendicular alternative. It is not easy to come up with such a thing. I will not try to do it here. But if it were something you wanted to do, I'd understand. If politics is your thing, it's a hard thing to quit. The Paths of the Dead. The subtitle of this book references a line from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn, the heir to the throne of Gondor, seeks allies in his war against the Dark Lord Sauron. He goes in search of an army of dead men. Many years ago, these men swore an oath to fight for Gondor. They broke their oath, and were cursed to remain among the living. They took up residence in the mountains. They haunted the mountain passes, and said to one who wandered near, "The way is shut. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut. The dead do not suffer the living to pass, and all who take their path share their fate. No sensible person takes this road. But Aragorn does. He is a very special leader, and he has a very special sword, and when he holds the dead to their oaths, they fulfill them. The American political system was made by the Founding Fathers, by those who are dead. Living Americans who try to make use of American democracy find that they cannot wield it. It has ossified, it has lost whatever dynamism it once possessed, and it has become a tomb for idealists and reformers. Worse, it leeches on their energies, holding them up as examples of the potential it forever claims to have but never delivers upon. The sensible person follows the subaltern in keeping far away from it, in doing everything possible to avoid throwing their energy into democracy's bottomless pit. But some of us are not sensible. Some of us have what the kids call main character energy. Some of us think we are Aragorn, or Lycurgus, or Rousseau's legislator, or Machiavelli's reorder of republics, or some other such thing. For this kind of person, the fact that American politics has become a quixotic pursuit only makes it more romantic. Little more than a century ago, the social theorist Max Weber pointed out that it was no longer possible to establish a religious consensus, but that a certain kind of person could not help but try anyway. As science does not, who is to answer the question, what shall we do, and how shall we arrange our lives? Only a prophet or a savior can give the answers. If there is no such man, or if his message is no longer believed in, then you will certainly not compel him to appear on this earth by having thousands of professors, as privileged hirelings of the state, attempt as petty prophets in their lecture rooms to take over his role. All they will accomplish is to show that they are unaware of the decisive state of affairs. The prophet for whom so many of our younger generation yearn simply does not exist. But this knowledge in its forceful significance has never become vital for them. The inward interest of a truly religiously musical man can never be served by veiling to him and to others the fundamental fact that he is destined to live in a godless and profitless time by giving him the ersatz of armchair prophecy. The integrity of his religious organ, it seems to me, must rebel against this. Today's truly politically musical person will be unmoved by all the arguments of this book. They will go on trying to make the American political system work or to replace it with some other system most of us are unlikely to find attractive or acceptable. Most of those who remain involved in American politics will be involved for cultural reasons connected to their continued participation in the terminological turf wars we described in Chapter 4. The American political system checks madness with madness. It creates conflicting forms of unreasonableness, pits them against one another, and ensures they stand in each other's way. It stages a forever war between descriptive representation and symbolic representation, between progressivism and conservatism, in which economic problems are always pushed to the margins. Yet there will be some small handful of people who find they cannot follow the paths laid out in chapters 4 or 5. They are not drawn into the cultural discussions that permeate the universities, but they find themselves unable to quit politics for some enclave, always under siege. These people will take the paths of the dead not out of pride, but because they can see no other road. As Aragorn puts it, I do not go gladly, only need drives me. Therefore, only of your free will would I have you come, for you will find both toil and great fear, and maybe worse. The way is shut. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it. Epilogue. This book is a work of political theory, albeit a work heavily shaped by the events of the past 2 decades. I started following the news in the year 2000, when, as an 8-year-old boy, I developed a strange obsession with the presidential contest between Al Gore and George W. Bush. During the 2000s, I was attentive but pre-theoretical. I had broadly progressive liberal positions on most issues. In particular, I opposed the Iraq War because it struck me as deeply stupid. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Democracy would not solve all of Iraq's problems or bring peace to the Middle East. When President Bush was re-elected in 2004, I began to wonder if representative democracy itself was deeply stupid. I have since developed a more complicated relationship with progressive liberalism. But this intuition from childhood, that American democracy can produce stupid decisions, that democracy could not solve Iraq's problems, and therefore democracy is not to be treated as infallible or beyond criticism, stayed with me. It was not until after the global economic crisis of 2008 that I began to read political theory in a serious way. I went to an American public high school in Valparaiso, Indiana, where political theory was not assigned. As I approached university, I gave myself 3 different works of theory to read, first Plato's Republic, then Hobbes' Leviathan, and finally Marx's Manifesto, along with a chunk of Capital. On the first pass, it was not the differences among these theorists that stood out to me, but the similarities. Like many naive readers, I tended to think that every smart person I read agreed with me in their own unique way. I de-emphasized the areas of contestation in the service of constructing my own view. Once I came to university, I was trained out of this. But I have retained a willingness to be syncretic, to consider how seemingly unrelated works and perspectives might be combined to produce insights that cannot be had by staying within one phylum. I came to the University of Warwick in 2010. While at Warwick, I was significantly influenced by Tim Fowler. Tim, who is now a lecturer at the University of Bristol, gave me my first formal instruction on many of the canonical texts, and he taught a brilliant module on issues in contemporary political theory. The emphasis at Warwick tended to be on analytic political theory. It was important to be clear, to be precise, for arguments to be constructed in a transparent and accessible way. Consistency was highly valued. It was a very philosophical approach, tending to focus around what the concept of justice requires. My undergraduate dissertation reflected the more normative, moralistic focus characteristic of Warwick's politics department at that time. In that dissertation, I read Rawls against Rawls, arguing that democracy was unable to deliver on Rawls' conception of justice. In particular, I was frustrated with the level of economic inequality democracy was generating. In 2013, I wrote, if Rawls was right, and the liberal egalitarian conception of justice is the correct one, most developed democratic states have grown measurably less just in recent years. In this dissertation, I propose that the cause of this is a persistent, structurally predictable tendency for the citizens of modern democratic states to periodically elect unjust rulers. Justice is a necessary part of any good society, and if our political structures result in the denial of justice, it is necessary that we question their soundness in the first place. The argument was subversive from the point of view of democracy, but it was otherwise straightforwardly Rawlsian liberal. Its implications were technocratic. I was still very young, and I thought that if educated would-be professionals like me had more political power, we would run the economy in a more just way. But even then, at the age of 21, something gnawed at me. I was aware that many people disagreed with Rawls about justice. These people disagreed with me about it, too, and they would go on disagreeing with me, even if I spent years trying to refine Rawls' view to make it better in various ways. The following year, I went to University of Chicago, becoming part of their Masters of Arts program in the Social Sciences, MAPSS. It was at Chicago that I first spent serious time with continental political theory. Coming from Warwick, the style of French and German theorists initially struck me as pretentious or unnecessarily obscure. Often, we would read these works in isolation, without a thorough grounding in the traditions that preceded them, and this made it harder to properly assimilate them. I remember struggling with dialectic of enlightenment, unable to make sense of the distinction between instrumental and substantive reason. Ultimately, it was the courses I took on ancient political thought that helped me make sense of this literature. When I studied Aristotle's Politics, I noticed a distinction he draws between the virtuous craftsman and the vulgar craftsman. I wrote, "The vulgar craftsman, because he is guided by the profit motive, conflates that which earns him money with that which provides for the good. As a result, even when the vulgar craftsman has leisure, he does not put that leisure toward virtuous purpose. Instead of deliberating about how to act, about the good and the beautiful, the vulgar craftsman uses his leisure to deliberate about how to produce in such a way that he will further maximize his potential financial gains." It is for this reason that Aristotle endorses with enthusiasm the Theban notion that the rulers should abstain from participation in the market. I came to understand that in a society dominated by instrumental reason, the profit motive dominates social relations, penetrating cultural production and turning very nearly everyone into a vulgar craftsman. Since for Aristotle the vulgar craftsmen are unfit to rule, a capitalist democracy in which the profit motive dominates is a political system in which no one is fit to rule in the Aristotelian sense. If American democracy is to work, it must therefore require less virtue from its citizens than Aristotle asks of his. It became clear to me that to demand that everyone converge on one conception of distributive justice asks too much from the citizens of a capitalist democracy. In my master's dissertation, I shifted focus away from justice. I began to argue that rising economic inequality threatens the democratic system, and that redistribution is necessary to prevent political instability. The thesis drew substantially on the work of Austro-Hungarian economic historian Karl Polanyi, along with some contemporary political scientists, like Carls Boy and Larry Bartels, 87 to 89. I tried to ground the argument in history and in empirical economic texts. The argument was still motivated by a normative commitment to improve the standard of living for ordinary Americans, but I papered over this normative commitment with a thin sticking plaster. At 23, I proceeded to Cambridge for the PhD. Cambridge was and is quite different from Chicago or Warwick. There is more emphasis on the history of thought, and the history of thought is taught in a more comprehensive way. Eventually, I started teaching the 3 histories of political thought papers at Cambridge. Each paper featured a wide range of topics. Preparing to teach these papers forced me to become substantively familiar with many theorists whose names I had never heard, with some theorists I had pompously ignored, and with some theorists I had encountered only in a superficial way. But while politics at Cambridge is very historically oriented, my supervisor, David Runciman, improved me as a thinker in large part by challenging the historical analogies I used to construct my arguments. At an early meeting, he asked me an essential question. Yes, there are a number of ways in which the post-2008 crisis is like previous crises, but what about the ways in which it's not? If we build our arguments around history alone, we miss what is genuinely new and distinctive about our own time and place. Insofar as empirical political science focuses on what has gone before, it is always a step behind the times. Political theory is valuable in part because it enables us to think about the present moment and the near future without relying on the assumption that patterns from the past will repeat. As I worked on my project, I served as Runciman's research assistant on his 2018 book, How Democracy Ends. In the course of that research, I happened upon a piece about Athens by W.G. Forrest. It included this passage about why democracy was so deeply entrenched there. The most important part, once again, is that the stability of democracy is undisputed. But now this stability is analyzed. Sea power depends on the demos and the demos depends on sea power for its profits. The demos knows that these profits reach it safely only under a democracy, ergo, so long as Athenian sea power lasts and the profits come in, there will be democracy. There is inefficiency and corruption in this democracy, a point that Aristophanes makes all the time, but the demos finds it worthwhile to put up with this in order to get its benefits. The demagogues are much less competent than clever young men would be in running the country, but again they add to the demos's pleasure because they strengthen the democracy and increase the benefits. Therefore they are not to be got rid of. In fact, it is no use hoping to change any details, however much in need of change they may be. All minor points are necessary side effects of democracy, and since democracy cannot be shifted, with all its weaknesses, it must be accepted. In Forrest's account, There is plenty of awareness that Athenian democracy is not really run by the people, but by the demagogues, by the class of talkers. There is awareness that in all sorts of ways Athenian democracy performs poorly. But there is nonetheless a set of reasons. Athenian democracy cannot be shifted. No matter how many deficiencies the clever young men of Athens identify in the Athenian political system, none of that criticism changes the fundamentals. In my notes to Runciman, I wrote, Forrest goes on to say that those who wished to get involved in politics would realize they had to beat the demagogues at their own game. The alternative was to stay aloof from it all, or perhaps drink yourself to oblivion. This description of Athens reminded me very much of the current situation in the United States. Ancient Athens is, in many respects, nothing like the contemporary United States. But in this one respect, the contemporary United States struck me as more similar to Athens than to, say, Germany in the 30s. The solution was not to do a historical comparison with Athens rather than Germany. It was to dispense with historical comparisons altogether and to instead think about embedded democracies in the abstract. The PhD thesis became focused around whether economic inequality could cause a legitimacy crisis in an embedded democracy, in a wealthy democracy with a long, established history, where it is hard to imagine any alternative political system finding traction. As the work went on, it focused more on the concept of legitimacy, drawing increasingly heavily on Bernard Williams. Chapter 3 of this book is perhaps the closest to that thesis in both style and content. As the thesis focused more heavily around Williams, I became increasingly engaged in the Bernie Sanders movement. I wrote many blog posts to support the campaign, and I wrote pieces for the Huffington Post and Current Affairs. Sanders emphasized the importance of economic inequality and economic rights, especially in 2016. If democracy could not be shifted, then staying politically engaged meant finding a way to beat the demagogues at their own game. I supported Sanders in an effort to reconcile my own politics with the view that we are stuck with the existing democratic system. But the Bernie Sanders movement ultimately failed. It failed because it is, for all the reasons I've detailed in this book, extremely difficult to deliver meaningful economic change through the American political system. Significantly for the development of my own thinking, it also failed in part because many rump professionals did not get behind it in 2016, and in part because it became dominated by the concerns of fallen professionals in 2020. This made me take a long, hard look at my own politics. In my early to mid-20s, I naively assumed that most professionals had views similar to my own on distributive justice and on the economy. I also naively assumed that most professionals were prioritarian in Rawls' sense, that they would put the material needs of poor and working-class Americans above their own selfish causes. I was mistaken on both counts. There are some professionals who prefer centrist candidates, there are some professionals who care more about social issues than economic issues, and there are some professionals who are under too much stress to do politics in a strategic way. This disappointment in the professional class reminded me of Aristotle's comments on the vulgar craftsman. The professionals relate to the market in a fundamentally troubling way, and it affects the professional class's ability to play a constructive role in politics. In my teaching, I became increasingly interested in ancient political theory, especially Plato and Aristotle, and in the Marxist tradition. But while I increasingly found myself sympathetic to Marxist critiques, I nonetheless opted to frame my PhD around legitimacy, rather than ideology, and around Williams's conception of legitimacy rather than that of Habermas or Rawls. I did this because I was increasingly interested in the descriptive question of whether the American political system was in a crisis, i.e., whether it was stable, whether it was even capable of being sustained as a modus vivendi. It seemed increasingly obvious to me that if it was stable, it was not because it was stable, for the right reasons. I do not think the American political system is just, has ever been just, or is ever likely to become just. I do not buy into the Whiggish moral progress narratives we associate with Habermas and his followers, nor do I have confidence in the revolutionary dreams of Zizek or Bolivar. My view of American democracy is most similar to the view Forrest ascribes to the clever young men of Athens. It cannot be shifted, but it is, to put it bluntly, a bit shit. My question, then, is whether this bad, defective system can continue, given how bad and defective it is. I do not think American democracy can be justified, normatively, nor do I think it can succeed in justifying itself, descriptively. But this doesn't stop it from continuing on, from muddling through, to use Runciman's words. To put it a different way, Marxist theorists are right to criticize capitalist democracy, but they are wrong to think that it will give way. The liberal realists are right to think that capitalist democracy is a very durable, tanky political system, but they are wrong to think that it is a good system, or that most people today are living well. American democracy is much more miserable and much less just than the liberal realists admit, but it is much more durable and much harder to shift than most folks on the left acknowledge. In point of fact, the question of whether the American system is just and the question of whether it is stable have little to do with each other. This book syncretizes Marxist critiques of capitalist democracy with liberal realist apologies. That said, while both Marxists and liberals often like to imagine that capitalism and democracy can be treated as separate, I emphasize their interdependence. The economic system and the political system are mutually reinforcing. Each contributes to the horrendous dysfunction of the other. Yet at the same time, each helps to sustain the other in the face of that dysfunction. There will be no democratic solution to the capitalist problem, and there will be no capitalist solution to the democracy problem. There is no version of democracy that is untroubled by class conflict, and there is no version of capitalism that is well regulated or morally contained. What we have is chronic agonism and chronic agony. For the most part, I've tended to prefer to put the argument in terms that are more liberal realist than Marxist. Many Americans are unfamiliar with Marxist language and find continental political thought obscure, frustrating, and inaccessible. I want Americans who have received a conventional liberal education to be able to read this book and make sense of it and engage with what it has to say. I do, however, insist on talking about class. Without class, economic discussions become unsubstantial. They start focusing too much on income or education level as mere signifiers and too little on the effects the performance of particular economic roles has on people's values and worldviews. Very often in the United States, income level is used as if it were a suitable replacement for class categories. Income level groups together people who perform radically different economic and social roles. A wage worker who earns $50,000 has a very different economic experience from a college-educated professional who earns $50,000, and they both have a very different economic experience from a small employer who earns $50,000. Reductively collapsing these three different experiences into an income band is a form of social scientific malpractice. The same is also true of replacing the income category with an education category. There is a big difference in the economic experience of someone who has used a college degree to obtain a prestigious professional role and someone who has not been able to do this. There is also a big difference between someone without a degree who earns a wage and someone without a degree who is an employer. Eliminating this complexity makes class appear less effective at predicting political behavior, and that makes other demographics seem more relevant by comparison. This is not to suggest that people's values and worldviews are purely a consequence of their class position. Very often, as soon as class is mentioned, the accusation of class reductionism issues, not to improve discussions of class but to silence them. Many theorists who object to discussions of class are nonetheless happy to ascribe agency to abstract national peoples, cultural groups, or to democracy, in a general sense. A review of The Confidence Trap published in New Left Review criticized Runciman on this last point. If crises are arbitrarily selected and redefined to fit Runciman's conceptual mold, democracy is risibly hypostasized as a continuous, conscious agent. It is always doing this or that. Democracy always brings something new. Democracy lives from moment to moment. Democracy renews itself without transforming itself. It never fully wakes up and it never fully grows up, when not busy muddling on, it holds its breath and survives. The real substance of democracy, antagonistic parties and interests, the clash of ideas, struggles over structure and constitution, executive accountability or corruption, is entirely absent from the confidence trap. The reviewer, sociologist Dylan Riley, has a point. It is not enough to talk about democracy and democratic procedures. We need to dig into the class antagonisms that mark American democracy. At the same time, Riley spends entirely too much of his review scolding Runciman for failing to take the right normative positions about various substantive issues. The liberal realists are interested first and foremost in whether order can be maintained. So, when Runciman, and when I, talk about crises, we are talking about situations in which there appear to be very real, very serious threats to the survival of the political system, to the order that system exists to maintain, or to the fundamental character of that system or that order. We are not merely talking about cases in which we normatively judge the political system to have failed to live up to some conception of justice. The political system morally and normatively fails every second and every minute of every day. Its moral failures are not crisis-making, they are utterly banal. What is remarkable about political systems is their ability to maintain order despite their hypocrisy, despite the fact that they very clearly vitiate not just the moral standards of left-wing commentators but even the moral standards they themselves purport to uphold. Runciman makes the very clever point that these hypocrisies do nonetheless have a normative effect on political systems. Because states claim to exercise power in a morally acceptable way, they must try to be seen to do this, and in trying to be seen to do this, they act better than they would if they dispensed with their lies. States tell legitimation stories. They tell stories about why you should accept the order they instantiate. Their stories are not true, but the effort to keep the stories plausible sounding forces states to conduct themselves in a more restrained way. Legitimation stories are built around certain key abstractions. In Chapter 4, I make specific reference to liberty, equality, and representation. These are the terms American democracy uses in its legitimation stories to persuade Americans that they ought to accept the order it defends. But these abstractions do not have any clear, fixed definition. They have no essential meaning. In this respect they are similar to Zizek's sublime objects of ideology. But where Zizek focuses on a single object that unites the whole society, on my account states tell a plurality of different legitimation stories, framing their acts in different ways for different audiences. They use lots of different abstract terms, and they define the terms in inconsistent ways, so that their acts can be potentially justified from many different points of view. Instead of one single public reason, or one single sublime object, there are multiple discourses built around multiple different definitions of multiple different key terms. The state does not have to succeed in persuading its audience that its acts are justified. At most, it needs merely to persuade them that it cares about these terms, that they can use these terms to hold it to account and to potentially improve its behavior. The definitions of these terms themselves are objects of political struggle, and the distribution of wealth and power affects who is in position to define them. Often liberal theorists are interested in gradually extending these terms, in making them more demanding or more encompassing, to bind the state and slowly but surely domesticate it. On this liberal view, the state's moral stance is adopted for pragmatic reasons, but then it becomes a political straitjacket. Liberal realists purport to have dispensed with moralism, but we see this same impulse in Runciman's work and in Williams's and in Schlur's. These theorists do not think that liberal democracy will fulfill a moral vision, but by having to pretend to fulfill a moral vision, it will come closer than it otherwise would. I differ insofar as I think that even this is too much of a progress narrative. I do not think liberal democracies are gradually and incrementally delivering a kinder politics. On the contrary, it is my observation that while political professionals prattle on about kindness in the culture, their economic policies grow ever crueler toward the poor and working people, the people whose labor allows us to write. The state is not being slowly domesticated by liberal mores. On the contrary, the state is being dominated by oligarchs and corporations, and increasingly it no longer needs to be viewed as morally legitimate to succeed in maintaining order. It runs, increasingly, on despair, on the fact that the political imaginarium is so thoroughly restricted that it is impossible to believe that there might be any better way of doing things. The American political system is attacking our imagination. It finds ways to turn even seemingly radical, subversive critiques to its advantage, by inducing would-be critics to use its terminology. It is both an incredibly durable system and an incredibly debased, fell thing. This book is an attempt to take both of those points seriously at the same time.